Walking is the finest thing a human body was ever built to do. Ask any doctor. Ask any grandmother. Ask the poster tacked to the wall in every waiting room in the country. 10,000 steps. Go for a walk. Move your legs, and your body will thank you. Walking burns the fat off you. It settles your blood sugar down after a big meal. It keeps the heart quiet and strong. And it does all this using your legs in exactly the slow, rhythmic, gentle way that all the metabolic science says is the very best way. No gym, no barbell, no membership fee, just you and a pair of shoes and a sidewalk. For the health of your metabolism, the whole grand machinery of how your body handles sugar and fat, the answer has been the same for 100 years. Walk. That is the answer. Case closed. Everybody go home. Now I want you to sit with how comfortable that feels. Because it feels true. It feels like one of those things that is so obviously right, you would be a little embarrassed to question it. Of course walking is good for you. Of course moving is better than sitting. Your grandmother knew it. Her grandmother knew it. And here is the thing that makes it feel even more solid. It is not just folk wisdom. There is real science underneath it. Stacks of it. Careful studies with treadmills and oxygen masks and blood draws, all pointing the same direction. The people who walk more tend to be healthier. The people who sit all day tend to be sicker. That is not a superstition. That is a measured, repeated, honest fact about human beings. So I am going to tell you something now, and I want you to notice the little jolt when I say it. That whole beautiful picture, walking as the king of metabolic medicine, the best gentle thing you can do for your sugar and your fat. It is wrong. Not a little wrong around the edges. Wrong at the center, and I can prove it to you with something you are probably resting on right now without thinking about it. Your heel. Let me tell you what your heel has been hiding from you your whole life. There is a tendon at the back of your ankle. The thick cord you can feel if you reach down and pinch just above where your foot meets your leg. That is the Achilles tendon, and it is one of the strongest, springiest ropes of tissue in the entire body. Now when you take a step, when your foot comes down and your weight rolls forward over it, that tendon stretches. It stores energy, the way a bent bow stores energy, the way a stretched rubber band stores energy, the way a diving board bends down under a jumper and holds that push for an instant. And then, at the end of the step, when you push off the ground to swing your leg forward, that tendon snaps back. It gives the energy back to you. And here is the part that ought to stop you cold. It gives back 80 to 90% of what you put into it. Almost all of it. The tendon does the work, so your muscle does not have to. Think about what that means. There is a muscle down there, deep in your calf, buried underneath the big bulgy one you can see. It is called the soleus. It is a small muscle, a modest muscle. It makes up only about 1% of your body weight, 1 part in 100. And when you walk, that little muscle barely does anything at all. Oh, it is switched on. It is holding tension, it is carrying force. But it is hardly moving. It hardly shortens. The scientists have a lovely cold word for this. They call it nearly isometric, same length. The muscle stands there like a post holding a fence, taking the strain but not really working in the way you would think working means. It is the tendon, that beautiful elastic spring, that is doing the moving. The muscle just anchors it. And a muscle that holds still, that stays nearly the same length while the springy tendon whips around it, that muscle spends almost no fuel, almost no energy. It sips. It idles. The chemical currency your muscles spend to do work, the little molecule called AP, adenosine triphosphate, that is the coin your cells pay out to make anything move. And a nearly isometric muscle, a muscle holding still under load, pays out very, very little of it. It is thrifty. It is stingy. It is doing the least it possibly can. Now stop and ask yourself the question that ought to be forming in your mind. If your body went to all this trouble, growing a magnificent spring in your ankle so that your calf muscle barely has to fire when you walk, then what on earth was walking designed for? Because it certainly was not designed to burn a lot of energy. If anything, It was designed to do the exact opposite, to get you from here to there while spending as little fuel as the laws of physics will allow. And that is exactly right. That is the whole secret that turns the comfortable story on its head. Walking is not an energy-burning machine. Walking is an energy-saving machine. It is one of the most efficient ways of moving a body across the ground that nature ever came up with. Your ankle joint alone does about 60% of all the positive mechanical work in your lower body when you stride along, and a big chunk of that work is not your muscle-burning fuel. It is that tendon, that catapult, handing energy back for free. By some careful estimates, the Achilles tendon and its elastic bounce account for around 35% of the whole energy budget of walking. 35% of the work given to you for nothing by a rubber band in your leg. So when your body walks, it is behaving like a miser. It is minimizing. It is squeezing every step for maximum distance at minimum cost. That is a triumph of engineering. It is the reason our ancestors could wander for miles across the grass looking for food and not fall over dead from exhaustion. But it is a very strange thing to then turn around and prescribe as the great medicine for a metabolism that is drowning in too much fuel. We tell sick people, people whose blood is thick with sugar and fat they cannot clear, we tell them to go do the single most fuel-efficient thing the human body knows how to do. Do you see the trouble? We are telling them to burn off their excess by doing the activity that evolution specifically tuned to burn as little as possible. I am not saying walking is bad for you. Please hear me clearly. Walking is a wonderful thing. It moves your blood, it works your heart, it clears your head, it keeps your joints oiled and your bones honest. I would never tell a soul to stop walking, but if the goal, the specific goal, is to make one particular muscle burn a great steady river of fuel for hours at a time, to hold your metabolism up high and keep it there, then walking is a peculiar tool for the job. Because the muscle we most want to fire, that little soleus, is exactly the one walking was built to let off the hook. Now here is where it gets strange, and where I want to hook you and keep you for a good long while. Because you might reasonably say, well, all right, if walking barely works the soleus, then let us find some hard exercise that does. Let us run. Let us climb stairs. Let us really pound that calf. And that is a sensible thought. But it is not where this story goes, and that is what makes the whole thing so delicious. There is a movement. It is so simple that you could do it right now, in the chair you are sitting in the bed you are lying in, without standing up, without breaking a sweat, without so much as setting down whatever you are holding. And that movement, that one small quiet thing, burns roughly 5 times more energy every minute than walking briskly down the street. 5 times per minute, while you are sitting perfectly still from the waist up, using that same 1% muscle that walking lets sleep. And it is not a claim from some magazine or some fellow selling a machine on late night radio. It comes out of a careful laboratory, out of real measurements, oxygen masks and blood samples and hours of patient recording, published in a scientific journal only a few years ago, and it is one of the most surprising results in the whole business of human metabolism to come along in a very long time. So we have a mystery on our hands, you and I. How can a muscle that is 1/100th of your body weight, a muscle so small and so lazy during walking that it barely twitches, suddenly become the biggest fuel-burning engine in your entire body, outburning your enormous thigh muscles, outburning the whole apparatus of running, all while you sit in a chair doing something that looks like nothing at all? How can sitting still beat walking? That should be impossible. Everything we just said about efficiency, about the miserly, thrifty body, should make it impossible. It is not impossible. It is real, it is measured, and by the time we are done, you are going to understand exactly why, right down in the machinery, down in the fibers and the fuel and the little firing nerves. But to get there, we have to first take apart, piece by piece, the comfortable story we started with. We have to understand why sitting became the villain, why walking became the hero, and why both of those ideas, as reasonable as they sound, miss the real thing entirely. So let us go back, and let us do it slowly, and let us start with the villain everyone agrees on. The chair. Think about what a chair actually does to you. You come home, You fold yourself into it, and something very quiet happens. Your big muscles, the ones in your thighs, the great sheets of muscle across your back and your seat, they go silent. Not resting, exactly. Switched off. The electrical chatter that runs down the nerves and tells them to fire, it fades to almost nothing. A muscle that is not being told to contract is a muscle that is not burning fuel. And so the furnace, the great slow furnace of your body, banks its fires. The sugar that would have been pulled out of your blood and burned, it stays in the blood. The fat drifting through your veins, the little droplets of it, they keep drifting. Nothing is asking for them. Nothing is calling them in to be burned. Now multiply that by the hours. The average person in this country, if you follow them around with a stopwatch, spends something like 10 hours a day sitting. 10 hours. That is not a lazy person. That is an ordinary person with a job and a car and an evening. You add up the desk and the meal and the drive and the chair at the end of the day, and you have most of your waking life spent with the great muscles switched off. And the numbers that come out the other end of that arrangement are sobering. More than half of the adults in this country are walking around with something the doctors call metabolic syndrome, or with the diabetes it slides into. And if you look at the people past 65, the number climbs to something like 4 out of every 5, living with diabetes or with the state just before it, the one where the blood sugar is already creeping high and the body is already losing the thread. 4 out of 5. That is not a disease of the unlucky few. That is very nearly the ordinary human condition, at least the way we live now. So it is no wonder, is it, that sitting got its reputation. Somebody looked at all of this and drew the obvious line. The chair silences the muscles. The silenced muscles stop burning. The unburned fuel piles up in the blood, and the piled up fuel is exactly what the disease is made of. So the chair is the villain, and the cure naturally is to get up out of it and move. Move anything. Go for the walk. It is a clean story, and the cleanness of it is part of why we believed it so completely. And I want to be fair to that story because there is real truth buried in it. The people who looked at sitting and got worried were not fools. They noticed something genuine. If you take two groups of people, and one group is on their feet all day and the other is parked in a seat all day, and you follow them for years, the ones on their feet do tend to fare better. Their hearts, their blood, their sugar. That is a real observation made carefully more than once. The sitters really do carry more of the trouble. So the epidemiologist, the person who counts populations and watches what happens to them, was not making things up. Sitting is associated with the disease. That word, associated, is doing a great deal of quiet work, and we are going to come back and lean on it very hard. But for now, take the observation as honest. Standers do better than sitters. Movers do better than the still. Here is the trap, though, and I want you to see it forming, because it is the whole hinge of everything that follows. From that honest observation, sitting is bad, we jump to a conclusion that feels like the same thing but is not. We concluded that the badness lives in the posture, in the sitting itself, in the geometry of a bent knee and a folded hip. And so the cure, we decided, must be to undo the posture. Stand up, straighten out, walk. If the problem is that you are sitting, then plainly the answer is to stop sitting. That feels airtight. It feels like it could not possibly be wrong. And it is wrong, or at least it is aimed at the wrong thing, and I can begin to show you why with a single fact from the very experiments we are marching toward. When Hamilton and his people in Houston finally measured what their heel raise could do, they did something clever. They did not just measure the young and the fit and the active. They gathered people across the whole spread of ordinary life, old ones and younger ones, men and women, people who already moved a lot in their days, and people who barely moved at all, people who piled up steps and people who piled up hours in a chair. And when the benefit came, when the blood sugar flattened and the fat burning climbed, it came for all of them. It did not care how much you already sat. It did not care how many steps you had banked that day. The good thing happened regardless of your sitting time, regardless of your step count. Now stop and feel how strange that is against the story we just told. If sitting itself were the poison, then the person who sits 10 hours ought to be a different animal, metabolically, from the person who sits 3. The heel raise ought to rescue the heavy sitter and do almost nothing for the light one, because the light one has less poison to undo. But that is not what happened. The benefit was almost indifferent to how much you had been sitting, which means the thing the heel raise is switching on is not simply the opposite of sitting. It is not just anti-chair, it is its own separate lever. A lever that was sitting there unpulled whether you spent your day in a seat or on your feet. And that is the first loose thread. Give it a gentle tug, and the whole tidy garment of the sitting story starts to come apart in your hands. Because here is the thing the tidy story never asked. It never asked what precisely standing and walking were doing that sitting was not. It just assumed. It assumed that if sitting switches the muscles off, then walking must switch them gloriously on. All of them, in a great blaze of burning. It pictured the walker as a furnace roaring, and the sitter as a furnace cold, and the difference between health and disease as simply the difference between roaring and cold. It is a lovely picture. And when the people with the instruments finally went and measured the walker, muscle by muscle, joint by joint, they found that the furnace of walking is not roaring at all. It is banked almost as low as the chair, for reasons that are among the most beautiful in all of the mechanics of living things. Walking, it turns out, is one of the thriftiest, most miserly, most energy-hoarding tricks the body ever learned. Your body walks the way a clever merchant spends, grudgingly, and never a coin more than it must. But I am getting ahead of myself, and this is a night for going slowly, so let me hold that thought and let it hang there in the dark for a while, the way you might hold a card you are not ready to play. Walking is cheap. Remember that. We are going to spend a good long stretch understanding exactly how cheap and by what mechanism, and it is going to involve a spring hidden in your heel that most people go their whole lives never knowing they carry. For now, sit with the crack we have opened. We began with 2 facts that everyone agrees on, and they seem to fit together like a hand in a glove. Fact 1, sitters get sick more than movers. Fact 2, therefore move. And we have just found the first place where the glove does not fit the hand. The cure the Houston people found does not behave like the opposite of sitting. It behaves like something new, something that walking, for all its virtue, was never actually delivering. And if walking was never delivering it, then all those decades of prescribing walking, all those doctors and all those decades and all those good intentions were aimed a little bit past the target. Not at nothing. Walking is genuinely good for you, and I will never tell you otherwise. But past the target in the sense that the single most powerful metabolic lever in your whole leg was one that walking barely touches, and standing barely touches, and that you could pull while doing the very thing we had all agreed was the villain. Sitting down. So we have our villain, the chair, and already the villain is looking a little wronged, a little falsely accused. That is a good place to be suspicious. When the obvious culprit starts to seem too obvious, when the story is too clean and the moral too tidy, that is exactly when a careful person slows down and starts checking the alibis. And the alibi we most need to check belongs to the hero. Walking. Everyone loves the hero. Nobody thinks to ask the hero any hard questions. So that is precisely where we are going to point our light next. We are going to walk one single step in the most excruciating slow motion, from the heel touching the ground to the toe leaving it, and we are going to ask at every instant exactly which muscle is firing, and how hard, and what it is spending to do it. And what we find in that one slow step is going to overturn, quietly and completely, the picture of the roaring furnace. The walker, it turns out, is barely spending anything at all in the very muscle we most care about. And to understand how that is possible, we have to meet the little catapult buried behind your ankle. So let us take that step together, and let us take it slower than any step has ever been taken. You are standing at the edge of a curb, you lean forward just a little, and you begin to fall. That is really all walking is, when you strip it down. You fall forward and you catch yourself, and then you do it again and again, and the catching is so smooth and so practiced that you have long since stopped noticing it. Your heel comes down first. It touches the pavement, And in that instant, a small drama begins at the back of your ankle. A drama that almost nobody in the history of medicine bothered to watch closely. Because it happens in a fraction of a second and it happens silently. And the muscles that matter are hidden deep under the skin where you cannot see them work. Now the heel is down and your weight begins to roll onto the foot. Your body, which was tipping forward, is now pivoting over the ankle like a pole vaulter's pole planting in the ground. And here is where the little machine wakes up. Running from the back of your heel up into the meat of your calf there is a thick, glistening cord, the strongest tendon in your whole body, the Achilles tendon. You could hang a grown person from it and it would not tear. And as your weight rolls forward over that planted foot, this cord gets stretched. It gets stretched the way a bowstring gets stretched when the archer draws it back. It gets stretched the way you pull back the elastic of a slingshot before you let a stone fly. I want you to feel what that means, because it is the whole secret, and most people walk their entire lives without ever suspecting it is there. When you stretch a spring, you are not throwing energy away, you are storing it. You are putting energy into the spring, and the spring is holding it for you, patiently, like a coin dropped into a piggy bank. The Achilles tendon in the first half of your step is a piggy bank. Your falling body does the work of stretching it, and the tendon quietly banks that energy and waits. And then comes the beautiful part. In the second half of the step, when it is time to push off, when it is time to lift your heel and send yourself forward onto the next foot, the tendon gives the coins back. It recoils. It snaps back toward its resting length and it hurls your body forward, and it does this almost for free. Because the energy it is spending now is the very same energy your falling body put into it a fraction of a second ago. It is a catapult. It really is a catapult, sitting there behind your ankle, cocking itself on every heel strike and firing on every toe off, over and over thousands of times a day, and you have never felt it fire once. Now how good is this catapult? Because a cheap slingshot loses most of its snap, and a good one keeps almost all of it. And when the biomechanics people finally put their instruments on it and measured, they found something that ought to make you sit up, even here, even drifting towards sleep. This tendon gives back somewhere between 80 and 90% of the energy you store in it. 80 to 90%. That is an astonishingly efficient spring. Think about what that number is telling you. It is telling you that for the great task of pushing your body forward at push-off, your muscles barely have to pay. The tendon pays. The tendon fronts the money, holds it, and returns it, and your muscle only has to cover the small change, the 10 or 20% that leaks away as heat. And it goes further than one tendon and one push. If you tally up all the useful mechanical work your leg does to carry you forward in a single stance, all the lifting and the pushing and the propelling, and you ask where it happens, you find that the ankle joint is doing about 60% of it. Not the hip, not the knee. The ankle, that humble hinge down at the bottom, is the great engine of the stride, and of the total energy walking demands, that one elastic cord, the Achilles alone, is estimated to supply about 35% for free out of its little piggy bank just by stretching and snapping. More than a third of the cost of walking, paid not by burning fuel in a muscle, but by a rubber band recycling energy it already had. Do you see what is happening to our story? We came in believing that walking is a roaring furnace, that every step is a great combustion, that the reason your doctor sends you out around the block is that walking makes your legs burn through fuel like a locomotive shoveling coal. And now, step by step, in this excruciating slow motion, we are watching that furnace turn out to be something much sneakier and much cleverer. Walking is not a furnace. Walking is a machine designed over millions of years to move you as far as possible while spending as little as possible. Evolution did not build you to burn calories on your afternoon stroll. Evolution built you to not burn them. It built you to get across the savannah to the next waterhole without starving on the way. Thrift, not extravagance, was the goal, and the catapult in your ankle is the masterpiece of that thrift. Nature does this everywhere, by the way, once you start looking. Watch a kangaroo bound across a field. It looks like it should be exhausting, all that leaping, and yet a kangaroo hopping fast actually spends less energy than you would expect, because its legs are enormous springs, storing and returning energy with each bound, so that hopping faster barely costs it more. Watch a child on a pogo stick. The child is not lifting herself with muscle on every bounce. The spring is doing it. The child only feeds in a little to make up for what the spring loses. Watch a good runner, light on the feet, seeming to bounce off the road rather than pound into it. Springs everywhere all through the animal kingdom, all doing the same quiet trick, storing the energy of the fall and giving it back to the rise so the muscle can rest. So I want to plant a suspicion in you now, gently, and let it grow while we go on. If the tendon is doing 35% of the work of walking, and if the tendon gives back nearly 90% of what you put in it, then the muscle behind that tendon, the muscle we came all this way to investigate, might be doing far, far less than we assumed. It might, in the middle of a brisk, healthy walk, be barely stirring. It might be sitting there almost still, tense but hardly moving, while the tendon does the dramatic work of stretching and firing. And a muscle that is tense but hardly moving is, as we will see, a muscle that is spending almost nothing. That is the crack in the story, and it is a serious one. Because if walking barely wakes up the very muscle that turns out to matter most for your blood sugar and your fat and your metabolism through the long sitting hours of your life, then all that walking, as good as it is for your heart and your mood and 100 other things, might be leaving the one furnace we actually want unlit. But I am getting ahead of myself, and we are supposed to be going slowly. Let us hold that suspicion and look harder at the muscle itself, because I have been calling it a spring servant, and that is not quite fair to it. This muscle is a very strange and very special piece of biological machinery, and to understand why it can do the thing we are building toward, the thing that beats walking, we have to understand what it is made of and why it is built so differently from the big showy muscles you flex in the mirror. It sits deep in the calf, tucked underneath the bigger muscle you can see, the one that gives your calf its bulge. It is quieter and flatter, and it hides. Its name, from the old Latin, is the same word as the flat sole of a sandal, and also the same word, curiously, as a certain flat fish that lies on the bottom of the sea. The soleus, a flat, patient, hidden muscle named after a sandal and a fish, and it is about to become the most interesting muscle in your entire body. Here is the first strange thing about it. Consider how the catapult even works. For the tendon to store energy, something has to hold the other end of it firm. A slingshot only launches the stone if your hand holds the frame steady. If your hand went limp, the whole thing would just flop and nothing would fire. So when your Achilles tendon is being stretched by your falling weight, the soleus at the top of it is not idle. It is holding on. It is gripping the frame. It is pulling tight so the tendon has something to pull against. But, and this is the exquisite trick, it is pulling tight while barely changing its own length at all. It braces. It holds. It stays almost the same size while the tendon stretches and recoils around it. And a muscle that produces force while barely changing length is doing what we call an isometric contraction, from the Greek meaning equal measure, equal length. Same length, lots of force. And it turns out that this, holding firm without moving, is one of the cheapest things a muscle can possibly do, which is exactly why nature chose it. Now let me show you why holding still is cheap, and why moving is dear, because that difference is the hinge on which this entire mystery finally turns. Picture two workers hired to move sand across a yard all afternoon. The first worker is told, "Just hold this heavy bag against your chest and stand there. Don't walk anywhere. Just hold it." He grumbles, but he can do it for a long, long time. His arms burn a little, sure, but he settles into it. His muscles clamp down, the fibers lock against each other like a knot pulled tight, and once that knot is set, it costs him surprisingly little to keep it set. The second worker is told, "Take that same bag and lift it up over your head, then lower it, then lift it again, over and over, all afternoon." And within 20 minutes he is soaked through and gasping. Same weight, same bag, same man. But one job is holding, and the other job is moving, and moving is where the money goes. Why is that? What is it about actually shortening a muscle, actually pulling the two ends closer together, that drains the account so much faster than merely holding firm? To see it, we have to go down inside the muscle, down past what your eyes can see, into the little machinery that does the pulling. Because a muscle is not a rubber band, and it is not a rope. though it behaves a bit like both. A muscle is a crowd of tiny grabbing hands, and those hands are where the whole secret of sheep versus deer is hiding. Down in there, inside every muscle fiber, you have two kinds of filament laid side by side, sliding past one another like two rows of interlaced fingers. One set is thick, one set is thin. And reaching out from the thick filaments are millions of little molecular arms, and each arm has a head on the end of it, and that head can reach across, grab onto the thin filament next to it, and give a little tug. Then it lets go, cocks back, reaches out again, grabs a little further along, and tugs again. We call these little arms the cross bridges, because they bridge across the gap between the two filaments. And this reaching, grabbing, tugging, releasing, reaching again, that little rowing motion repeated by millions of these heads all along the muscle, that is the entire act of a muscle pulling. That is the engine. A billion tiny oars, all rowing. Now here is the thing you must feel in your bones to understand this whole lecture. Every single time one of those little heads lets go and recocks to grab again, it costs 1 unit of fuel. One little molecule of the body's energy currency gets spent to reset that oar. We call that molecule by its initials, ATP, adenosine triphosphate. But you don't need the chemistry. Just picture it as a single coin dropped into a slot to cock the oar back for one more stroke. Grab, tug, release, drop a coin, recock. Grab, tug, release, drop a coin, recock. That is how muscles spend. So now watch what happens in the two jobs. When the man is holding the bag still, when the muscle is isometric, at the same length the little heads grab on and they tug and they just hold. They stay latched. A latched head is a cheap head. It has already paid its coin and now it simply hangs on bearing the load, like a man gripping a rope and just standing there holding it. Some of them slip and re-grab, so it isn't perfectly free, but the turnover is slow. Few coins per second. The knot is tied and the knot mostly stays tied. But when the man lifts the bag, when the muscle actively shortens, now every one of those millions of heads has to row. Grab, pull the thin filament along, let go, recock, reach to a fresh spot, grab again. Stroke after stroke after stroke, and every stroke drops another coin in the slot. A muscle that is shortening quickly is a muscle whose billion oars are all rowing as fast as they can, and the coins are just pouring out of the pockets. That is why lifting exhausts you and holding merely tires you. Movement is the metabolic expense. Movement is where the fuel is burned. Holding is comparatively free. And now, at last, you can see the whole cruel joke that walking plays on you, and you can see it with your own inner eye. When you walk, the muscle that could be your greatest metabolic furnace, the soleus, is put to work in the one mode that costs almost nothing. It is holding. It is bracing against the tendon while the tendon does the moving. The oars in your soleus are latched, not rowing. The catapult in your ankle whips the energy back for free, the fibers stay their same length, the coins stay in the pocket, and you glide down the sidewalk spending as little as evolution could possibly arrange for you to spend. Which was the whole point. Your ancestors needed to walk for miles across the savannah looking for food, and a body that burned a fortune doing it would have starved. So nature, that relentless accountant, built you a leg that walks for almost nothing. Congratulations, you are magnificently, beautifully efficient. And efficient is exactly the wrong thing to be when the problem you now face is not scarcity, but sitting in a chair for 10 hours a day with more sugar in your blood than your body knows what to do with. Sit with that irony for a moment, because it is one of the loveliest reversals in all of physiology. For nearly all of human history, the ability to move cheaply was survival itself. The person whose muscles sipped fuel instead of gulping it was the person who made it home. And so we inherited, every one of us, a set of legs engineered by 1,000,000 years of hunger to do as little metabolic work as possible while carrying us as far as possible. The tendon catapult, the latched and holding soleus, the near isometric grip, all of it a masterpiece of thrift. And then, in the blink of an eye, in a couple of generations, we sat down. We sat down at desks and in cars and in soft chairs, and suddenly the great inherited gift of thrift became the great inherited curse. Now we have too much fuel, not too little, and we are riding around inside bodies that are exquisitely, stubbornly good at not burning it. So the question sharpens to a fine point. If walking barely lights the soleus up, because walking is designed not to, then is there a way to make that same little muscle rebel against its own thrifty programming? Is there a way to take those latched resting oars and force them gently to row and to keep rowing hour after hour without the muscle ever getting tired? Because remember, exhaustion is the enemy of any long project. The second worker with the bag over his head quit in 20 minutes. If you want a muscle to burn fuel steadily all day long, you cannot use a muscle that burns out. You need a very particular kind of muscle for that. You need a muscle that can row forever. And this is the moment to stop and really look at the soleus itself. Because it is not an ordinary muscle, it is a strange one. It is, in fact, one of the most peculiar and specialized muscles in your entire body, and almost nobody ever thinks about it. It sits underneath the big showy calf muscle, the one that bulges when a dancer points her toe, the gastrocnemius. The gastrocnemius gets all the attention. It is the one you can see, but hidden beneath it, broad and flat and deep, running from just below the knee down to the heel, is the soleus. The name comes from the Latin for a flatfish, a sole, because some old anatomist thought its broad flat shape looked like a fish lying on the seafloor. And this flatfish of a muscle, this quiet thing you have never once consciously thought about, is doing something for you every single second that you are upright. Something so continuous and so faithful that it deserves a much better name than the one it got. Because consider what it means to simply stand up. You think standing is doing nothing. You think standing is rest. But standing is a slow motion catastrophe that never quite happens. Your body is a tall, top-heavy tower balanced on two small feet, and the center of all that weight sits up high, somewhere around your belly, well above the little hinge of your ankle. A tower like that does not want to stay up. It wants to topple, and the direction it most wants to topple is forward, pitching your weight out over your toes, because that is how the geometry of the ankle works. Every moment you stand, you are falling forward, just a little, and something has to keep catching you. Something has to keep quietly pulling you back from the brink over and over, tirelessly, or you would pitch face first onto the floor. That something is the soleus. It runs down the back of your lower leg and anchors to your heel, and when it pulls, it tips you gently back, away from your toes, back into balance. And then you drift forward again, and it catches you again, and it does this all day. Thousands upon thousands of tiny corrections, so smooth and so constant that you never feel a single one of them. You believe you are standing still. You are not standing still. You are being held up, moment by moment, by a patient flat muscle that never once takes a break the entire time your feet are under you. It is the pillar. It is the guy wire. It is the thing that makes the difference between a standing human and a heap on the ground. And a muscle assigned to that job, the job of holding you upright from the moment you get out of bed to the moment you lie back down, cannot be a sprinter. It cannot be the kind of muscle that fires hard and then collapses in exhaustion. Imagine if the muscle keeping you from falling on your face got tired after 20 minutes. You would spend your life toppling over every time you stopped to think. No, a postural muscle must be built for endurance above all else, built to work gently and continuously for 16 hours without complaint. And when nature builds a muscle for that kind of tireless all-day work, she builds it out of a very special material, out of a very special kind of fiber, and the properties of that fiber are the next piece of our puzzle, and as you will see, the reason this whole strange trick works at all. Let me tell you what that special material is. If you were to take a thin slice of your soleus, thinner than a sheet of paper, and stain it with the right dyes and hold it up to a microscope, you would see something rather beautiful. You would see a sea of fibers, packed together like the cells in a honeycomb, and most of them would glow a deep, rich red. That red is not decoration. That red is machinery. It is the color of a muscle built for the long haul, a muscle stuffed full of the tiny furnaces that burn fuel slowly and steadily, hour after hour, without ever asking for a rest. Now, muscles, it turns out, are not all made of the same stuff. You have, roughly speaking, two great families of fiber in your body, and they could hardly be more different in temperament. There is the fast kind, the sprinter, the fiber that can produce an enormous burst of force in a fraction of a second. And there is the slow kind, the marathoner, the fiber that produces a gentler force but can keep at it seemingly forever. The fast fibers are pale, the slow fibers are red, and the reason for the color is one of the loveliest little facts in all of physiology, so let me linger on it, because it explains everything that follows. The red comes from two things working together. It comes from a pigment inside the fiber, a cousin of the stuff that makes your blood red, whose whole job is to grab onto oxygen and hold it close, ready for use. And it comes from the little furnaces themselves, the mitochondria, which are packed into these slow fibers in tremendous numbers. A furnace needs oxygen the way a fire needs air. Choke off the air and the fire goes out. So a fiber that intends to burn fuel steadily all day long had better arrange for a generous, uninterrupted supply of oxygen, and that is exactly what the red machinery is for. The pigment holds the oxygen, the furnaces consume it, and the fuel goes up in a slow, controlled, tireless flame. Now here is where the soleus reveals just how unusual it truly is. If you looked at the big muscle in the front of your thigh, the one you use to kick a ball or leap off the ground, you would find that fewer than half of its fibers are the slow red kind, roughly 42 out of every 100. The rest are pale sprinters ready for explosive work. And if you looked at the gastrocnemius, that bulging muscle you can see on the back of the calf, the one that gives shape to a dancer's leg, you would find a little over half of the slow red kind, something like 57 out of 100. A mixed crowd, some sprinters, some marathoners sharing the work. But the soleus, the soleus is a different animal entirely. In the average human soleus, something like 80 out of every 100 fibers are the slow red endurance kind. 80%, and in some people it runs higher still, all the way up toward 100%, a muscle that is almost purely marathoner, almost entirely built out of that patient, oxygen-hungry, slow-burning material. There is hardly another muscle in the whole human body so committed to endurance, so thoroughly stacked with furnaces, and so nearly empty of sprinters. When I told you this muscle was strange, this is a good part of what I meant. It is one of the most single-minded, most specialized endurance muscles you own. And now you begin to see why that matters. A fiber packed with mitochondria, wired up to a rich blood supply, dripping with oxygen-grabbing pigment, is a fiber that lives to burn fuel by combining it with oxygen. That slow, complete oxygen-fed burning is the process that squeezes the most energy out of every scrap of fuel. And, more to the point for our story, it is the process that keeps going and going without poisoning itself, without choking on its own waste, without running the tank dry. The sprinter fiber burns fast and dirty and quits. The marathoner fiber burns slow and clean and simply does not stop. And when you want a muscle to work for 3 hours, or 4, or an entire waking day, the marathoner is the only kind that will do. So consider the situation nature has arranged. She needed a muscle to hold you upright all day. She built it sensibly, almost entirely out of endurance fiber, out of these tireless red furnaces. That was the whole design goal. Keep the human standing without wearing out. But in solving that problem, she accidentally built into the back of your calf a device of extraordinary metabolic power. A muscle that, if you could only get it to actually work hard, to contract and shorten again and again instead of just holding stiff, would be able to burn fuel at a ferocious rate for hours on end without tiring. She built the perfect fat furnace, and then, as we shall see, arranged your everyday walking so that this furnace almost never gets lit. That is the little tragedy hiding in your own leg, and it is also the opportunity. There is one more property of this muscle I want to put in front of you, because it is going to matter enormously later, and it has nothing to do with fuel or fibers. It has to do with wiring. It has to do with how easily you can switch the thing on. Every muscle in your body is commanded by nerves. A signal travels down from your spinal cord, races along a nerve fiber, and arrives at the muscle with an instruction: contract now. But not every muscle is equally easy to command. Some muscles are wired to nerve cells that are, so to speak, hard to wake up. It takes a strong, insistent signal to get them going, and that is by design, because you do not want your explosive sprinting muscles firing off by accident every time you shift your weight. You want them to stay quiet until you really mean it. The soleus is not like that. The nerve cells that command the soleus, the little switches sitting in your spinal cord that decide when it fires, have what we call a low threshold. They are easy to wake up. They respond to the gentlest of nudges. And once again, this is no accident. It flows directly from the muscle's day job. A muscle that must hold you upright continuously, adjusting 100 times a minute to keep you from swaying over, needs to be exquisitely easy to activate. It has to respond to whispers, not shouts. So nature wired it up to the most easily triggered nerve cells in the whole lower limb. The soleus is in a sense always half awake, always ready, always the first to answer the call. Now hold that thought, because it is going to become the key to a magic trick. If you have a muscle that is enormously good at burning fuel for hours, and that muscle also happens to be the very easiest one in your leg to switch on and keep switched on, then you have the makings of something remarkable. You have a furnace that runs forever and a pilot light that ignites at the faintest touch. The only question left is how to get the thing burning and how to keep it burning without exhausting yourself in the process. And the answer to that, curiously, will turn out to depend on sitting down. But we are not there yet. Before we get there, I want to take you on a small detour, because I think it will deepen your respect for this muscle, and it raises a question that genuinely puzzled the people who study these things. The question is simply this: why do you have so much soleus in the first place? Why is it so big? You might think, well, all animals that stand and move around must need a good soleus. But that turns out to be quite wrong, and the wrongness of it is instructive. Go and look at a horse. A horse is a magnificent athlete, a creature that can run for miles, that stands almost all day and even sleeps on its feet. Surely a horse has a mighty soleus. And yet if you dissect the horse's leg, you find the soleus has all but vanished. It is a wisp, a vestige, a little leftover scrap of tissue that barely does anything at all. The same is true across a great many four-legged animals. The soleus, so central to us, is in them a forgotten afterthought. And it is not just horses. When you compare across the mammals and account for the size of the animal, you find that we humans carry something like 10 times as much soleus relative to our body weight as most other mammals do. 10 times. That is not a small difference. That is not the sort of thing you shrug off as random variation. When a muscle is 10 times bigger in one creature than in its relatives, nature is trying to tell you that this creature is doing something the others are not, something that leans very hard on that particular muscle. So what are we doing that the horse is not? The horse runs faster than we ever will. The horse is stronger. The horse stands longer. And yet we are the ones who grew the enormous soleus. What is the difference? The difference, I think, is the strangest thing about us. The thing that makes us us. We stand up, not on 4 legs, spread wide and stable like a table. On 2 legs, balanced on end like a broomstick stood upright on your palm, forever on the edge of falling, forever correcting. A horse standing still is a stable arrangement, 4 posts under a heavy body. A human standing still is a controlled emergency, a tall column teetering over 2 small feet, saved from toppling only by ceaseless, subtle, moment-to-moment muscular vigilance. And the muscle doing most of that saving, the muscle firing quietly all day long to keep your teetering column from crashing down, is the soleus. That is why it is huge in us and tiny in the horse. We paid for our upright posture, for our free hands and a high view of the world with a muscle that never truly rests. And here is the thread that ties it all together, the thing I want you to carry with you into what comes next. The very same little nerve cells that fire all day to keep you standing, the low threshold switches we just spoke of, are the exact ones this whole trick is going to hijack. In quiet standing, they fire to hold the muscle stiff, barely shortening it at all, sipping energy. But if you could keep those same easy switches firing and change only what the muscle does when it answers, ask it to shorten fully and repeatedly instead of merely bracing, then you would be pouring fuel into a furnace that was already lit, that has been lit all your life, that you never even noticed was burning. And that small change, that one alteration in what the muscle is asked to do, is the whole secret. Let me show you now exactly how it works. So picture yourself in a chair. An ordinary chair, nothing special about it. Your feet are flat on the floor, your shoes off if you like, the balls of your feet resting on the ground, and your heels resting there too. Now you lift your heels. Just your heels. The front of your foot stays pressed to the floor, and the back of your foot rises up, the way it does when a woman walks in high shoes, or the way it does when you reach up on your toes to fetch something off a high shelf. Except you are sitting. So you are not lifting your whole body. You are just lifting your heels off the floor and then setting them back down and lifting them again. That is the whole motion. That is the entire trick. It looks like nothing. If you did it in a room full of people, no one would even notice you were doing it. And yet inside your calf, something extraordinary is happening. Something that took a laboratory full of very careful people several years to measure and even longer to believe. Let me tell you why this simple bobbing of the heel is so different from the walk you take around the block. When you walked, remember the tendon did the work. The muscle held itself stiff and let the great elastic cord in your ankle stretch and snap, spending almost nothing. The muscle was a clamp. It was a brake and a clamp and a post to hang a spring on. It barely changed length at all. But now you are sitting, and there is no spring to help you, and there is no falling body to catch. There is only the muscle, asked to do the one thing walking never asks of it. Asked to shorten, asked to pull its two ends toward each other, again and again, slowly, deliberately, with no tendon catapult to steal the work away. And when a muscle actually shortens against a load, when it truly contracts through its range rather than merely bracing, it must spend energy. It must pull the little molecular ratchets past one another, and each pull costs fuel, and there is no clever spring to give that cost back. So the very laziness that made walking cheap is gone. You have removed the trick. You have taken away the catapult and left the muscle naked, doing honest labor. And here is the piece that surprised even the people measuring it. You would think that a motion this small, this gentle, this nearly invisible, could not possibly burn much of anything. A heel going up and down a finger's width, how could that matter? But remember what kind of muscle this is. Remember that it is packed almost entirely with the slow red tireless fibers, the ones stuffed with those little furnaces we call the mitochondria. This is not a muscle built for one great heave and then rest. It is a muscle built to burn steadily, for hours, without complaint, the way a good hardwood log burns low and long instead of flaring up and dying. So when you finally give it the one motion it was starving for, when you let it shorten over and over, it does not tire and it does not quit. It simply opens its throat and begins to drink fuel, and it keeps drinking minute after minute for as long as you keep the heels moving. Now I want to be careful and honest with you about how much fuel, because the numbers are the part that made me sit up straight when I first heard them. When you sit at rest, doing nothing, your whole body ticks over at some quiet baseline, burning a small, steady trickle of oxygen just to keep you alive. The people in Houston measured that baseline carefully. Then they had their subjects begin this little heel motion, this seated raising and lowering through a modest range, and they watched the oxygen consumption of the entire body climb. Through the smaller motion, a range of only about 15 degrees at the ankle, the whole body's energy use rose by half again above rest. Think about that. One small muscle in one part of one leg, and the energy budget of the entire body goes up by 50%. And when they let the range grow to about 30 degrees, a fuller motion of the heel, the whole body's energy expenditure did not rise by half. It doubled. It went to twice the resting rate. From a muscle that is 1 part in 100 of your weight. From a heel bobbing quietly in a chair. You must understand how strange that is. If I told you that you could double the energy your whole body spends, not by running, not by climbing stairs, not by hauling anything, but by moving a single small muscle you did not even know you had, you would be right to be suspicious. I was suspicious. That is exactly the mood I want you to keep, because the ordinary picture of the body says that big efforts cost big energy and small efforts cost small energy, and here is a small effort spending like a large one. Something in the ordinary picture must be wrong, or at least incomplete. And what is wrong is precisely the assumption we spent all this time taking apart. The assumption that muscles are muscles, that they all burn alike, that a small motion must mean a small fire. This particular muscle, with its particular fibers and its particular hunger, breaks that rule. It is a small motion that lights a large and lasting fire, and it can keep that fire going far longer than any sprint or lift or climb, because it never spends the way those violent efforts spend. And that brings me to the fuel itself, which is the next surprise and in some ways the deepest one. When your big muscles work hard, when your thighs drive you up a hill, they reach first into their own private pantry. Every muscle keeps a little store of sugar tucked inside it, called up in a form we call glycogen, its own emergency larder for when the work gets sudden and fierce. The thigh burns through that larder fast, and when the larder runs low, the muscle begins to ache and burn, and finally it fails you, and you have to stop and rest and refill. That is why you cannot sprint forever. You are eating your own stored sugar and you run out. But the little heel muscle in the chair does something almost unbelievable. It barely touches its own larder at all. Of all the fuel it burns during this gentle work, only a sliver, only about 1 part in 50, comes from its private store of glycogen. It leaves its own pantry almost untouched. So where does it get its fuel? It reaches out. It reaches into the bloodstream flowing past it, and it takes what is there directly. It pulls sugar straight out of the blood, the same sugar that rises in your blood after a meal. And it pulls fat straight out of the blood too, those little floating parcels of fat that circulate through everyone, and it feeds them into its furnaces on the spot. It does not stockpile and burn, it burns what flows by. And that is the whole reason it never tires. A muscle that eats its own larder must eventually empty the larder and stop. A muscle that eats from the river passing by can burn as long as the river flows, which is to say, as long as your heart beats and your blood moves, which is to say, essentially forever. The subjects in that first study kept the motion going for 3 hours, 4 hours, on, and they did not report the burning or the soreness you would expect. Elderly people did it, people who never exercised in their lives did it, and nobody was hurt and nobody was worn out, because you cannot wear out a fire that carries no fuel of its own to exhaust. Now hold both of these facts together in your mind, because together they explain the thing that sounds impossible. First, that this small muscle, when finally asked to shorten, spends energy at a ferocious rate, doubling the whole body's fire. Second, that it draws that energy from the flowing blood rather than from any store it could deplete. Put those together and you get a furnace that burns hot and burns endlessly, both at once. Ordinarily, you cannot have both. A hot fire burns out fast, a long fire burns low. The candle and the bonfire are meant to be opposites. But here, in this one peculiar muscle, with its slow red tireless fibers and its habit of eating from the river, you get a fire that is somehow both hot and unending. And that combination, that impossible sounding pairing of intensity and endurance, is the real secret the Houston laboratory stumbled into. I keep saying they stumbled into it, and I should tell you they did not set out expecting anything so dramatic. They were curious people looking carefully at a muscle nobody paid much attention to. They rigged up their subjects with the masks and tubes that measure every breath of oxygen going in and every breath of used air coming out, so they could weigh the body's fire the way you might weigh smoke. They had people sit and rest and then perform this humble seated heel raise, and they watched the meters climb, and I imagine there was a long quiet moment in that lab where somebody looked at the readout and simply did not believe it. Because the readings coming off that little heel muscle, measured per unit of muscle, ran higher than the readings you get from the whole lower half of the body when a person is striding hard on a treadmill. One small muscle in a chair outrunning both legs at once on a fast walk. That is the measurement that stopped them. That is the measurement I want you carrying with you as we go deeper. Because now we have to ask how such a thing could possibly be, and what it does to the sugar in your blood, and whether it truly beats the walk we were all told to take. So let us follow the sugar. When you eat, and especially when you eat something sweet or starchy, your gut breaks it down and pours glucose into your blood, and that blood glucose rises like a tide coming in. In a healthy young body, the tide comes in and goes back out politely, because the muscles and the liver open their doors and take the sugar inside. But in more than half of grown people in this country, and in most people past the age of 65, those doors stick. The tide comes in and it does not go back out. It sits there, high, hour after hour, and that lingering high tide of sugar is quietly corrosive. It stiffens blood vessels. It frays the tiny threads of nerve at your fingertips and your feet. It is the slow weather of the disease we call diabetes. Now, the usual advice, the advice we have been circling this whole time, is to go take a walk after you eat. And a walk does help. I will not pretend it does nothing. But look at what Hamilton's people saw when they had a person sit in a chair and simply raise the heels, gently for a couple of hours after drinking a measured dose of sugar. They used the standard test, the one clinics use everywhere, where you swallow 75 grams of glucose dissolved in water, a deliberately large and rude amount, and then they watch what your blood does over the next few hours. Ordinarily, that drink sends your blood sugar climbing into a tall, sharp peak. With the heel raises going, that peak was cut down by a little more than half. Between the first and the second hour after the drink, when the tide is usually at its highest and most damaging, the sugar in the blood ran roughly 50 milligrams per deciliter lower than it otherwise would. If you have ever stood in a doctor's office and heard those numbers read off a little machine, you know that 50 is not a rounding error. 50 is the distance between two different verdicts about your health. And it was not only the sugar. Think about what your body has to do to force sugar out of the blood and into hiding. It shouts. It shouts with a hormone called insulin, the chemical key that unlocks those sticky doors. When the doors are stiff, the body shouts louder and louder, pumping out more and more insulin, and that constant shouting is itself part of the sickness, because a body marinated in high insulin for years grows deaf to it, and the deafness makes everything worse. With the heel raises going, the body did not have to shout nearly so loud. Over the 3 hours after the sugary drink, the flood of insulin was around 60% smaller. The muscle was quietly taking the sugar off the body's hands so the body could stop screaming for it to be taken. That is a gentler chemistry. That is a calmer inside. I want to sit with why this particular little muscle can do that, because it is not obvious, and it is genuinely strange. You would think if you wanted to soak up a lot of sugar, you would want a big muscle, the great slabs of the thigh, the broad sheets of the back. Those are the warehouses. And yet here is this modest muscle deep in the calf, a muscle that makes up only about 1 part in 100 of your whole body weight, doing more for your blood sugar in a chair than the warehouses do when you jog. How? The answer is a lovely piece of biological engineering, and it comes down to what the soleus is built out of and what it chooses to burn. Muscle is not one single kind of stuff. It is woven from different threads, and broadly there are 2 families of thread. One family is fast and strong and impatient. Those are the fibers that let you leap, sprint, slam a door, catch yourself when you trip. They are magnificent, but they burn like dry straw. They flare up hot and they burn out fast, and while they burn, they mostly eat sugar in a hurried, wasteful, oxygen-skipping way that leaves behind that acid ache you feel when you sprint too far. The other family is slow and patient and tireless. Those fibers do not flare. They smolder. They are packed, crammed, absolutely stuffed with tiny furnaces called mitochondria, the little engines inside each cell that burn fuel cleanly with oxygen all the way down, squeezing out every last bit of energy the way a careful cook uses every scrap of the animal. Those patient smoldering fibers can keep going for hours and hardly notice. Most muscles in your body are a blend of the 2 families. Take the big muscle on the front of your thigh, the one that aches when you climb too many stairs. It is a fairly even mix, maybe a little under half of it the patient's slow kind. The larger of the 2 calf muscles, the one that bulges when you rise onto your toes, is a bit more than half slow, but the soleus, sitting quietly underneath, is something else entirely. In a typical person, around 80 out of every 100 of its fibers are the patient, slow, oxygen-hungry, furnace-packed kind, and in some people it runs even higher than that, nearly all of it slow. There is almost no other muscle in the human body so completely committed to endurance. It is as though nature took one muscle and said, "This one is not for leaping, This one is not for fighting, this one is for lasting. This one is for the long haul of simply being upright, all day, every day, for a whole human life. And once you know that, the outlandish measurement starts to make sense. A muscle this densely furnished can accept and burn an enormous amount of fuel per pound of itself, far more than an ordinary muscle can, because it has so many little engines running at once. Per pound, it is a powerhouse. The reason it looks small in the totals is only that there is not very much of it. But you are not trying to run a race with it. You are trying to keep a modest fire burning steadily for hours to soak up the sugar and fat drifting by in your blood. And for that, steady endurance beats raw size every single time. A campfire that burns all night warms you more than a bonfire that flares for 10 minutes and dies. The soleus is the all-night campfire of the body. Here is the part that I find almost too neat to be true, and yet it is true. What does this little furnace choose to burn? A working muscle usually reaches first for its own private pantry. Tucked inside muscle fibers is a stored starch called glycogen. A coil of sugar the muscle keeps on hand like a jar of flour in the cupboard so it can grab fuel instantly without waiting for a delivery. When you sprint, your leg muscles tear through that private pantry in minutes, and when the jar is empty, you are done. You hit the wall, your legs turn to lead. That is the ordinary way muscles fail. But the soleus, during these gentle heel raises, barely opens its own cupboard at all. Something like 2 parts in 100 of the fuel it burns comes from its private glycogen store. 2%. It leaves its own pantry almost untouched. Instead, it reaches straight out into the bloodstream and pulls in what is floating by. It grabs the glucose drifting in your blood, the very sugar you want removed. And it grabs the fat drifting in your blood, the little droplets of packaged fat that ride around in the circulation. It burns those directly, on the spot, as they pass. And do you see what an elegant trick that is? Because it is not eating its own larder, it never empties the larder, so it never hits the wall, so it never has to stop. It can smolder for hours and hours. That is exactly why the people in the study could sit there raising their heels for 3 hours, 4 hours, on some testing days closer to 4.5 hours, and report no fatigue at all, no burning ache, no soreness the next morning. There was nothing to run out of. The fuel was coming from outside, an endless river flowing past the mill, and the mill just kept turning as long as the river flowed. And what is that river carrying away as it turns the mill? Precisely the 2 things you would most like taken out of your blood: the excess sugar from your meal and the excess fat from your meal. In the fasting state, when there was no meal, that same steady burning roughly doubled the normal rate at which the body oxidizes fat, quietly working down the little fat droplets circulating in the blood. So the muscle is not only flattening the sugar peak, it is also at the same time dealing with the fat. One small motion in a chair, and both of the tides you worry about begin, gently, to ebb. Now I have been careful, I hope, not to oversell, so let me be careful here too. Everything I have just told you comes from a small number of studies, on a limited number of people, done in a laboratory with masks and meters and careful attention. It is early. Science that is early should be held loosely. But I will also tell you that the man who ran these experiments, a careful physiologist who has spent his life measuring the fires of the human body, put down a sentence that stopped me when I read it, and we are going to spend real time on that sentence next, because it is a bold one. And a bold claim deserves to be turned over slowly in the hand and examined from every side before you decide whether to believe it. Here is the sentence. He wrote that he was unaware of any existing drug, any promising drug, anything in the whole apothecary of modern medicine that comes close to raising and sustaining the body's slow burning of fuel at the magnitude he was seeing from this one small muscle in a chair. Now stop and feel the weight of that. This is not a man selling a bottle. This is a physiologist, a measurer, a person who spends his days distrusting his own instruments, and he has put his name next to the claim that a heel lifting off the floor did something no pill in the pharmacy is known to do as well. When a careful person says a wild thing, you should neither swallow it whole nor spit it out. You should chew. So let us chew. What would it even mean for a movement to beat a drug? A drug that lowers blood sugar, say the famous one that people take by the millions, works by nudging the liver to pour out less sugar and coaxing the tissues to drink in a little more. It leans on the chemistry. It sends a message. And messages can be ignored, resisted, muffled. The body over years learns to shrug at a signal that keeps arriving. That is a great part of the trouble with the sugar disease. The messengers keep shouting and the cells keep pretending not to hear. Insulin knocks, and the door swells shut. Now here is the different thing the muscle is doing. It is not knocking on a door and asking politely for sugar to come inside. It is simply on fire. And fire needs fuel, and the fuel is right there in the blood flowing past. The contracting muscle opens its own doors from the inside by a separate mechanism that does not need the insulin messenger to be obeyed. When a muscle works, it pulls glucose out of the blood through a channel that contraction itself unlocks. So you have two roads into the cell. One road is the insulin road, the one that gets blocked in the sugar disease. The other road is the contraction road, and in these people it is often still wide open, still smooth, still clear. The soleus, quietly firing in the chair, is driving traffic down the road that still works. That is why it can help precisely the people the messengers have stopped reaching. You see now why the comparison to a drug is not quite so outrageous as it first sounds. It is not that the muscle is a better chemical than the chemical, it is that the muscle is not a chemical at all. It is a pump that opens a second door. And a second door, in a house where the first door is jammed, is worth more than a better key for the jammed one. But I promised you we would turn this over and look at the other side, because a bold claim that only shows you its handsome face is not to be trusted. So let me argue against the man for a moment, fairly, the way I would want someone to argue against me. First, the number of people in these experiments is small. We are not talking about a great cast of thousands followed across their lives. We are talking about a modest group, watched carefully in a room for a matter of hours. That is how good science often begins, with a small, sharp, deep look rather than a broad, shallow one. But small and sharp is still small. The honest word for what we have is a beginning, not a verdict. Second, and this is the thing a good skeptic reaches for right away, the sitting still. If a movement lowers your blood sugar after a meal, well, so does almost any movement. A walk after dinner does it. Standing up and fidgeting does it. Wiggling your foot does a little of it. So the sharp question is not, does the heel raise lower sugar, but does it lower sugar more and for longer and with less effort than the ordinary movements we already know about? And here the interesting answer is that the size of the effect they measured was not the size of an idle fidget. A fidget might trim the sugar peak by a sliver. What they reported was the peak after a large sugar drink cut roughly in half, and the flood of insulin that follows a meal reduced by well over half across the hours after. Those are not fidget numbers. Those are numbers that made the experimenters check their meters twice. Third objection, and it is a good one. Maybe the trick works in the laboratory, with masks on faces and a technician reminding you to keep going, but falls apart in a real life full of forgetting. That is not a flaw in the physics. That is a flaw in us. And it is a fair worry, because the whole appeal of this thing is that you are supposed to do it while you are busy doing something else, and the very moment you get absorbed in whatever you are doing, your heel goes quiet on the floor and stays there. So the honest thing to say is that the muscle can do what he claims, and whether you will let it is a separate question, one about habit and attention, not about biology. Now let me put the drug comparison in its proper frame, so no one walks away with a foolish idea. I am not telling you, and he is not telling you, to throw your medicine in the river. That would be reckless, and it is not what the science says. The claim is narrower and stranger and more interesting than throw away your pills. The claim is that this one small action raises and holds the body's fuel burning to a height that we did not think a simple movement could reach, and that no drug is presently known to raise that same fire, that whole body furnace of slow oxidation to that same height for that same length of time. Those are two different questions. A drug can lower a number on a blood test without ever raising the furnace. The muscle raises the furnace, and the number on the test comes down as a consequence. It is the difference between painting the thermometer and lighting the stove. And there is a bonus tucked inside all this that has nothing to do with sugar or fat at all, and it is a piece of pure plumbing that I find delightful. Your blood has an easy job going down and a hard job coming back up. The heart throws it downhill into your legs with a good strong push, but then it has to climb all the way back up to your chest against the steady pull of gravity through soft veins that could easily let it pool in your feet like water in the low corner of a yard. How does it climb? It gets squeezed. Every time the muscles of your calf tighten, they press on the veins running through them, and the veins have little one-way flaps inside, little valves, so the blood can only go one direction, upward toward home. Squeeze, and a slug of blood is pushed up a floor. Relax, and the valve below shuts so nothing falls back. Squeeze again, up another floor. The calf is a second pump, working the return line while the heart works the supply line. People who study this have a lovely name for it. They call the calf the peripheral heart. A heart out at the edge of you, in your leg, that you never think about. Now think about what your seated heel, lifting and lowering, is doing to that second heart. It is running it. Every contraction of the soleus is a beat of the peripheral heart, driving the blood up out of your legs and back towards your chest over and over, for as long as you keep the little motion going. So the person quietly working the soleus in a chair is not only tending the furnace of their metabolism, they are also at the same time working a pump that keeps their blood from stagnating in their legs through a long, still afternoon. Two organs, the furnace and the pump, both switched on by the same small, deliberate movement, both switched off by the same stillness we fall into without noticing. That stillness is the real villain of this whole story, and I want you to see it clearly now, because we have been circling it all evening. It was never that sitting is poison in some mystical way. It is that sitting, done the way we do it, switches off two useful engines at once. The furnace goes cold because the great slow muscle stops burning. The pump goes quiet because the same muscle stops squeezing. 10 hours a day of that, day upon day, and you have not committed any single dramatic sin. You have simply left two engines idling in the off position for a very long time, and the body, being a practical machine, lets what is unused grow rusty. The sugar it does not burn, it stores or lets circulate too high. The blood it does not pump climbs sluggishly. Nothing collapses on any one day. It just quietly drifts. And the whole surprise of what we have been talking about, the reason it is worth 3 hours of a quiet night, is that the fix for a very small, very quiet, very continuous problem turns out to be a very small, very quiet, very continuous action. Not a heroic hour of sweat once in a while, thrown against a wall of stillness that lasts all day, but a small motion folded right into the stillness that keeps the two engines gently turning while you sit. The disease of the chair, treated in the chair by the muscle the chair had put to sleep. There is a symmetry there that a physicist cannot help but admire. The answer shaped exactly like the problem, only running the other way. We are not done with it yet, because I still owe you the fine print, the how slow, the how far, the how often, and the honest edges of what nobody yet knows. So let me pay that debt now, slowly, the way you would settle up with a friend at the end of a long evening, with no hurry in it. The first thing I owe you is the matter of how slow. Because your instinct, if you are anything like me, is that faster must be better. More is more. If a little motion helps, then thrashing your heel up and down like a sewing machine gone mad must help 5 times as much. And that instinct here is simply wrong. The people who did this work were quite clear about it. The thing that matters is not how quickly you snap the heel up and down. The thing that matters is how far the muscle travels. The range of the motion, not the speed of it. Let the heel rise, let the ball of the foot stay planted, and let the calf carry the weight through as full a sweep as it comfortably can. The smaller version, where the heel lifts through something like 15 degrees of arc, that alone lifts the whole body's energy burn about 1/2 above resting. The larger version, where the heel travels through roughly 30 degrees, doubles it. Twice the resting rate from a movement you could do without spilling a cup of tea balanced on your knee. And notice what that tells you. Doubling the range of the swing more than doubles the payoff. The reach is where the metabolism lives. So the instruction is almost the opposite of what a gym would shout at you. Do not rush. Do not strain. Reach. And here is why reaching is even available to you sitting down, which brings me back to a number I want you to hold on to, because it is the quiet hinge of the whole business. When you stand, the full weight of you presses down through the ankle. When you sit, only about 1/4 of your body weight loads that foot. 4 times less. Now think about what that lightness buys. A muscle contracting against a heavy load moves slowly and grudgingly, and it strains and it tears a little on the way back down, the way your thighs ache the day after you carry furniture up a staircase. But a muscle contracting against a light load can move quickly and freely and travel through its whole comfortable range over and over without that tearing on the return. So sitting is not the compromise you imagined. Sitting is the trick. The chair, which we spent so long calling the villain, turns out to hand you exactly the condition the muscle wants. A light load, a long reach, no bruising on the way home. The same posture that lets the disease creep in is the posture that lets the cure run for hours. I find that funny in the deep way, not the laughing way. Nature keeps folding the answer into the shape of the problem. Now how far, I have partly told you, in degrees of arc. Let me tell you the how often, which is gentler than you fear. The man who ran these studies suggests you begin with sessions of about 2 minutes. 2 minutes. That is all. You are not signing up for an ordeal. You lift the heels, you find the rhythm, you let the calf do its slow work for a couple of minutes, and you have already tilted the machinery. And then, if it suits you, you do it again later, and again, threaded through the ordinary dead time of a sitting day. The reading, the talking, the waiting. In the original work, the participants kept these contractions going for stretches of 3 hours, and in some sittings closer to 4.5 hours across a testing day. And here is the part that ought to stop you, if anything in this long night stops you. They reported no fatigue, no soreness, no overuse injuries, and these were not young athletes. These were older people, exercise-naive people, the very people for whom an hour on a treadmill is a punishment or a danger. One participant, we are told, logged more than 60,000 contractions in a single day across both legs. 60,000. Try to picture 60,000 of anything you do with your body, and you picture a wreck at the end of it, a limp, an ice pack. And there was none. The muscle simply did not mind. Why did it not mind? I told you the reason a while ago, but it is worth turning over once more in the low light, because it is the whole physical secret of the fatigue that never comes. An ordinary muscle, working hard, eats its own stored sugar. It has a little larder of glycogen packed right inside the fibers, and it burns through that larder, and when the larder empties, the muscle fails. That is the wall a runner hits. That is why your thighs give out. But the soleus, doing this particular slow shortening work, barely opens its larder at all. Something like 2% of its fuel comes from that stored glycogen. 2%. The other 98%, it pulls straight out of the passing blood, the glucose drifting by, the fat drifting by, the little parcels of triglyceride the liver sends out. It does not eat its own supplies. It eats the traffic. And a muscle that eats the traffic never runs out, because the traffic keeps coming as long as your heart beats and your gut delivers. That is the physical root of the whole strange endurance. Not willpower, not fitness. A fuel line that draws from the river instead of the reservoir. And while it draws from that river, it is doing the second job I keep circling back to, the one that has nothing to do with sugar or fat at all. Every time the calf squeezes, it clamps down on the deep veins buried in it, and it drives the blood in them upward, back toward the heart against gravity, the way you might squeeze a tube of paint from the bottom. This is why the old anatomists gave the soleus a second name, the peripheral heart. Your real heart pushes blood out to the far corners of you, but it has a devil of a time pulling it back up from your feet, because your feet are a long way down and the blood has weight. So the calf helps. In quiet sitting, the calf goes still and stops helping, and the blood pools and drifts sluggishly, and that is its own small quiet harm. But run these contractions, and the second heart wakes up, and starts its steady pumping again hour after hour, an entirely separate gift folded into the same small motion. One action, two engines. The metabolic one burning the fuel, the mechanical one moving the blood. You get both from lifting a heel. Now I promised you the honest edges, and a physicist who only tells you the bright middle of a thing and none of its edges is selling you something, not teaching you. So let me be careful and plain about what we do not yet firmly know. The most striking numbers I have given you tonight, the roughly 5 times more energy per minute than a brisk walk, the roughly twice the energy of running yourself to exhaustion, those particular figures come from the researcher's own explanations of his findings, from his direct written replies, and not from inside the peer-reviewed paper itself. Now that does not make them false. The man knows this muscle better than nearly anyone alive, and the numbers sit comfortably beside what the paper does report. But you should know which claims wear the full armor of peer review and which are the researcher speaking in his own voice. The doubling of oxygen consumption, the carbohydrate burn rising to between 2 and about 3 times the resting rate, the flattening of the blood sugar curve after a sugary drink, those live inside the reviewed work. The tidy 5 times walking headline lives just outside it. Hold the two a little differently in your mind, and there is the matter of how many people this has been tried on and for how long. The first study was, in the scale of these things, small, and it measured what happened over hours and over testing days, not what happens over years. It shows you the machine turning, vividly, in the moment. It does not yet show you a decade of turning, and what a decade of turning does to a life, to a heart attack that never comes, to a diagnosis that never lands. Those are the questions that take a long time and a lot of people to answer honestly, and they have not been answered yet. There is a later pilot study, a small replication in people who were already sliding toward diabetes, and it found a real improvement in the blood sugar spike after a meal, something like a third less, which points in the very same direction as the original, though under a different protocol and with a smaller number. Directionally consistent, as the careful phrase goes. Encouraging, not yet the whole proof. So what is the honest shape of the thing, said plainly, as I would want it said to me? We have a muscle, small, strange, slow, evolved in us far past its size in any other animal, wired to be easy to switch on, fueled straight from the bloodstream so it does not tire. We have a way of working it that the ordinary business of walking specifically switches off, because walking was tuned by evolution to be cheap, to spare this muscle, to let a tendon do the springing for free. And we have measurements, some fully armored, some the researcher's own reckoning, that say working it deliberately, gently, for hours, in a chair, moves fuel and moves blood at a rate that ought to be impossible for something 1% of your weight. That is where we stand. The mechanism is real and understood. The immediate effects are measured. The long story is unwritten, and I would rather hand you that, the true unfinished shape of it, than a shinier certainty I do not own. I still have a few things left to give you before I let the night close over us, because I have told you the what and the how. But I have not yet told you the deepest why. The evolutionary story of why you, sitting there, are carrying around a muscle 10 times larger than it has any quadruped right to be, and what that overgrown quiet thing was for, back before there were chairs to fall asleep in at all. So let us go back. Not 100 years, not 1,000. Let us go back much further than that, to a time before anyone had a name, before anyone had a word for a muscle at all, when your ancestors were learning to do a thing that almost nothing else on this planet does well. They were learning to stand up and stay up, to balance the whole long column of a body on 2 feet, and to keep it there hour after hour in the sun, watching, waiting, walking, and standing still. And here is the small strange fact I want you to hold gently as you drift. You are carrying, low in each of your legs, tucked beneath the bigger, showier calf muscle, a muscle that is about 10 times larger relative to your body weight than the same muscle in most other mammals. 10 times. Go and look at a horse. The horse is a magnificent runner, a creature built almost entirely for motion, and yet in the horse this very muscle, the soleus, is a shrunken little vestige, a leftover, a whisper of a thing. The horse barely has one. You have a great slab of one in each leg. Why should that be? Why should the animal that runs so beautifully have almost none, and the animal that mostly stands around and ambles have so much? The answer, as far as we can tell, is standing itself. Not running. Standing. A horse, when it stands, has a clever trick in its legs, a set of tendons and catches that lock its knees so it can doze on its feet like a piece of furniture, spending almost nothing. It does not need a big postural engine because it has borrowed the job out to its skeleton. But you, upright on 2 feet, balanced on a base no wider than a pair of shoes, cannot lock yourself into place like that. You are always, very slightly, falling. Every moment you stand, you are toppling a hair's breadth forward, and something quietly catches you and pushes you back, and you topple again, and it catches you again, and this goes on all day without your ever knowing it happens. That something, that patient invisible catcher, is largely this muscle in the back of your lower leg. It is the thing that keeps the tower from falling. And to do a job like that, all day, for a lifetime, without tiring, you cannot use just any kind of muscle. You need a very particular kind. You need the endless kind. And that is exactly what nature built into it. I told you earlier that this muscle is packed, more than almost any other in your body, with the slow red fibers, the ones full of those little furnaces, the mitochondria. The fibers that sip fuel steadily and never seem to quit. Around 80% of it, on average, is that patient sort, where the big thigh muscle out front is closer to 40%, and the flasher calf muscle above it sits somewhere in between. Now you see that this is not an accident of anatomy. It is a job description written into the meat. A muscle that must hold you upright from dawn to dusk simply cannot be made of the sprinter's fibers, the pale explosive ones that give you everything they have in half a minute and then collapse gasping. A sprinter's muscle would fail you before lunch. The stander's muscle, the one you actually have, is built to never quite finish. It is built for the long afternoon. And there is a second piece of the same design, and it lives up the spine in the wiring. The little nerve cells that command this muscle, the motor neurons that send it its marching orders, are wired with what we call a low threshold. That is a fancy way of saying they are easy to switch on. They wake at the faintest whisper of a signal. Most muscles keep their strongest units in reserve, only calling them up when you truly heave against something heavy. But the units that run this postural muscle are the first to answer, the ones already murmuring away while you simply sit and read, or stand and talk, or lean in a doorway. Nature made them cheap to recruit precisely because they are meant to be on nearly all the time. You do not want to spend a great act of will to keep from falling over. You want it to happen beneath notice, automatically, the way your heart beats without your asking. So the wiring was made agreeable, willing, quick to fire. The whole system, fibers and nerves together, was tuned across untold generations for one thing above all others: endurance without fatigue, the capacity to work gently and forever. Now sit with the beautiful irony of that, because it is the hinge of this entire long night's talk. Nature spent all that evolutionary effort building you a tireless engine, low and quiet in each leg, wired to switch on at the least excuse, fueled by furnaces that burn all day. And then it aimed that engine almost entirely at the dullest possible task: holding still, not falling down. The engine was built for endurance, and it got handed a job that asks it to barely move at all, to hold attention and stay there, nearly frozen, catching you as you sway. It is like forging the world's finest long-distance runner and then employing her for her entire life to stand in a hallway and lean very slightly against a wall. The capacity is enormous. The demand placed on it in ordinary living is almost laughably small. And when you sit down in a chair, which takes even the standing job away, you switch that great endurance engine down to nearly nothing at all. It idles. It waits. It has been waiting, in most of us, for most of our lives. What Hamilton's people did, when you strip away all the clever measurement, was notice the gap. They looked at this magnificent tireless thing sitting idle under everyone's chair, and they asked a question almost no one had thought to ask. What if we gave it a real job? Not the standing job, which is nearly still. Not the walking job, which, as we found, hands most of the work to a tendon spring and lets the muscle loaf. But a job that actually asks those endless red fibers to shorten and pull over and over gently for hours, the way they were always able to but were never asked to. And the engine, it turns out, does exactly what it was built to do. It runs and does not tire and pours through fuel the whole time, because that is the only thing it was ever designed for. We simply spent a few thousand years never once asking it. There is one more gift folded into this muscle, and it belongs to the night too, because it is about blood and about gravity and about the quiet mechanical trouble of being a tall creature. Think for a moment about where your feet are. They are far below your heart, a good long way down, and the blood that flows down into them easy and downhill then has to come all the way back up against the pull of the earth. Your heart pushes the blood out, but by the time it has trickled through the fine vessels of your foot and ankle, most of that push is spent. Something has to help lift it home. And here, once again, it is this same low, quiet muscle doing a second job you never knew it had. When it contracts, it squeezes the deep veins that run through it, and it presses the blood upward, and small one-way valves in those veins keep it from sliding back down. Squeeze, and up it goes. Relax, and the valves hold. Squeeze again, and up it goes a little further. People who study this have given the muscle a lovely nickname for it. They call it the peripheral heart. A second heart, low in the leg, pumping not by beating but by working, helping the real heart hold the blood back up out of the cellar. And now you see why this matters to our story, quietly, as a bonus tucked inside the main gift. When you sit for 10 hours, as so many of us do, that second heart falls still along with everything else. The blood pools and pools in the low country of your legs, sluggish, going nowhere, and the muscle that ought to be bailing it upward is asleep. But the very moment you begin that small, slow rocking of the heel, the gentle shortening of this muscle over and over, you are not only lighting the metabolic furnace we have spent all this time marveling at, you are also, with the very same motion, switching the second heart back on. Every contraction that burns a little fuel also lifts a little blood. The two jobs ride together on one simple movement. The engine that clears the sugar from your blood is the same engine that helps carry that blood home. Nature, having built you this one remarkable thing and then left it idling under a chair, folded two great gifts into it, and both of them wake to the same soft, patient, almost invisible motion. So when I tell you that this is a muscle built for endurance and starved of a real task, I am not being poetic for the sake of it. I am telling you the plain shape of a very old design. A tireless engine, wired to wake easily, fuel to run all day, given across the whole span of your ancestry the humblest of jobs, and now, at last, in a laboratory in Houston, handed something worthy of what it always was. That is the deep why underneath all the numbers. Not a trick, not a gadget, just an ancient capacity, finally noticed, finally asked. And there remains still a little more for us to turn over before the night is done, because I have shown you what this muscle is and where it came from, but I have not yet let you feel in your own two legs exactly what it would mean to wake it. So let me ask you to sit for a moment, not to lie back yet, just to imagine sitting, the way you might in a plain wooden chair, feet flat on the floor, knees bent at something near a right angle. And now imagine lifting your heels. Just your heels. The balls of your feet stay pressed to the ground, the toes stay down, and you roll the weight forward and let the heels rise up as far as they comfortably go, and then you let them settle back down. That is the whole motion. That is the thing. A person watching you from across a room would see almost nothing. They would see, if they were paying very close attention, the slight bob of your knees, and they might think you were tapping out the rhythm of some song only you could hear. And underneath that quiet little bob, the tireless engine I have been describing to you is finally, at long last, doing the one thing it was shaped to do. Now I want you to notice something about how little of you is involved in that. When you stand up and rise onto your toes, the way a person reaches for a high shelf, you are lifting your whole body. Every pound of you rides up on those two calves. But sitting down, with your thighs resting on the chair and most of your weight carried by the seat beneath you, Only about 1/4 of your body weight ever reaches your feet. 4 times less. The chair holds the rest. And you might think, well, that makes the exercise easier, and easier sounds like less, and less sounds worse. But here is where the ordinary intuition leads you exactly the wrong way, and I want to walk slowly through why. When a muscle is fighting a heavy load, it can only shorten slowly. Push against something enormous and you creep. Push against something light and you can snap through the motion quickly, and you can travel a longer distance before the joint runs out of room. So by taking 3/4 of the weight off the foot, you have not made the muscle lazy. You have set it free. Free to shorten faster, free to move through a wider arc, free to repeat the whole cycle again and again without the grinding strain that comes from heavy resistance. And it turns out that this fast, light, wide, repeated shortening is precisely the condition under which the soleus pours out its oxidative fire. Not the straining, the flowing. The load is low on purpose. The low load is the point. There is a further gift hidden in this. When you lower a heavy weight, when you let your body sink back down from your toes while standing, the muscle is being stretched even as it resists. It is breaking. That kind of contraction, the lengthening under tension kind, is the one that leaves you sore the next morning, the one that tears tiny fibers that must then be repaired. But seated, with so little load, there is almost none of that breaking damage. The muscle shortens, it relaxes, it shortens again, and it never has to fight itself on the way down. Which is why people in the Houston study could keep this up for 3 hours, for 4 hours, for the better part of a working afternoon, and report no soreness at all, and show no injury, even the ones who were old, even the ones who had never exercised a day in their lives. The motion is too gentle to hurt and too particular to waste. I told you earlier that this muscle wakes easily, and now I want to make good on that. Deep in the base of your spine, threaded out through the lower nerve roots, are the commands that reach down to the soleus. And the little cells that carry those commands, the motor neurons, come in a range. Some have high thresholds. They stay silent until you truly need power, until you sprint or leap or heave something heavy off the ground, and then they fire all at once and they tire quickly, because that is what they are for. But the ones that run the soleus sit at the other end. They have low thresholds. They are the easy risers, the ones that come online at the faintest request, the ones that hum away all day long just to hold you upright against the pull of the earth. You are using them right now in a sense whenever you stand. They are the postural crew, the quiet all-day workers. And here is the sly thing the seated heel raise does. It takes that same all-day postural crew, those same low-threshold, fatigue-proof little cells that were already perfectly willing to fire for hours, and it gives them a slightly different assignment. Instead of holding the muscle nearly still, the way quiet standing does, it asks them to let the muscle actually shorten, to travel, to complete the full contraction that walking so carefully avoids. Same easy-to-wake neurons, same tireless disposition. But now the muscle is doing mechanical work through a real range of motion instead of merely bracing. You have not recruited some fresh reserve of strength. You have simply changed the job description of workers who were always on the clock. That is why one person in these studies could log more than 60,000 contractions across both legs in a single day. 60,000. Try to imagine 60,000 of almost anything. And the legs did not fail, because the workers doing the lifting were the ones that were never going to fail in the first place. Now, what does this tireless engine actually burn? This is the part that, when I first followed it through, made me sit back in my chair. Most of your muscles, when they work hard, reach first for a fuel stored right inside themselves. Glycogen, a coiled up form of sugar packed into the muscle like logs stacked beside a fireplace. It is close, it is convenient, and it is finite. Burn through your stored glycogen and the fire goes out, and that is a great deal of why a sprinter cannot sprint forever, and why your thighs turn to jelly halfway up a very long staircase. They are eating their own larder, and the larder empties. The soleus, doing this particular motion, barely touches its own larder at all. Something on the order of 2% of its fuel comes from stored glycogen. 2%. Almost nothing. So where does the rest come from? It comes from outside. It reaches into the bloodstream flowing past it, and it pulls fuel straight from the current. It burns the glucose dissolved in your blood, the very sugar that rises after a meal, and it burns fat, the circulating droplets of fat that the liver ships out into the blood. It feeds from the river instead of from the pantry. And a muscle that feeds from the river never runs its pantry dry, and so it never has to stop. That single fact, that near total refusal to eat its own stores, is the physical reason this small muscle can run for hours, where your great powerful thigh would quit in minutes. Sit with the strangeness of that for a moment. The muscles we admire, the big ones, the ones that win foot races and lift heavy stones, are in a certain sense fragile. They are sprinters. They spend fast and they collapse. And this modest little slab at the back of your lower leg, the one so unremarkable that it hides entirely behind its flashier neighbor, the one that in a horse has withered nearly to nothing, is the marathoner of the whole body. It does not spend. It sips continuously from whatever is passing by. And because what is passing by, after you eat, is exactly the surge of sugar and fat that your body struggles to put away, this quiet marathoner turns out to be reaching for precisely the thing you most want cleared from your blood. I have been careful, all this while, not to let the numbers get ahead of the understanding, because a number you do not understand is just a noise. But we have now built enough understanding, I think, to be ready for the numbers. We know why the muscle is tireless. We know why the seated posture unleashes it rather than sparing it. We know why the easy waking neurons can fire all day. And we know that it feeds from the bloodstream rather than from itself. So when I tell you next that this little seated bob burns something like 5 times the energy per minute of a brisk walk, you will not hear it as a magic trick or a slogan. You will hear it as the natural consequence of everything we have just laid down, brick by patient brick, in the dark. Rest your attention there a while, and let the motion play once more behind your eyes, the heels rising, the heels falling, the river running past, before we go and look at just how large those numbers turn out to be. So let us go and look, gently, at just how large those numbers turn out to be. And let us do it the way an honest person looks at a surprising thing, which is slowly turning it over, checking that we have not fooled ourselves. The first number is the one that startled me most, and it is the one I told you was coming. When Dr. Hamilton and his colleagues measured the energy this seated bob was using minute by minute and set it beside the energy a person spends on a brisk walk, the seated bob was burning roughly 5 times as much per minute. 5 times. Not 5% more. Not a little edge. 5 times the rate of a good walk, done sitting in a chair with the heels quietly rising and falling. Now I want you to feel how strange that sentence is, because if you let it slide past, you will have missed the whole point of the evening. We have all been taught, without anyone ever saying it out loud, that effort and energy go together. The more it feels like work, the more fuel you must be spending. A walk feels like something. A little heel bob in a chair feels like almost nothing. Your body, sitting there, would swear to you it is barely lifting a finger. And yet the meter says it is spending fuel at 5 times the pace of the thing that feels like real exercise. The feeling and the fact have come apart. That gap between what a motion feels like and what it actually costs is, in a way, the secret the whole muscle has been keeping. And it gets more peculiar still, because they did not only compare it to walking, they compared it to running. Not an easy jog, but running to exhaustion, the kind where you have to stop because you simply cannot go on. And per minute, per unit of time, the little seated soleus bob was spending energy at something like twice that rate. Twice the energy per minute of running until you drop, sitting down. Not sweating, not gasping, just the heels going up and the heels coming down. I can hear the reasonable objection forming, because I felt it myself. Surely there is a trick here, surely they are hiding something in the words. And that is exactly the right suspicion to have. So let us take it seriously and see whether the trick holds up. The reasonable person says, fine, per minute it may be spending a lot, but a runner is heaving their whole 150 or 200 pounds down the road, all that muscle, all those limbs. Surely a runner spends more in total. And that is true. Over the whole body, added all together, the runner burns more, because the runner has enlisted nearly every large muscle they own. Nobody is claiming the little Bob beats a marathon for total calories in an hour. That is not the claim, and I would not make it, because it would not be true. The claim is narrower, and once you see it clearly, it is far more shocking than the loose version. The claim is about the muscle itself. This soleus, this one muscle, is only about 1% of your body weight. 1%. A small dark strap of tissue buried in the back of the calf, weighing a few ounces against the whole heavy architecture of you. And during these contractions, that 1% of you was raising the local rate at which it burns fuel to double, and in the better subjects triple, the entire whole body rate at which you were burning carbohydrate. Let me say that again slowly, because it deserves to be turned over in the dark. 1% of the body running its own little furnace so hot that the fuel it consumes matches and then doubles and reaches toward tripling what the whole rest of you together was burning at rest. That is not a muscle doing its fair share. That is a muscle doing a wildly, absurdly disproportionate share. And here is the measurement that made me sit up. The one that closes the door on the easy dismissal. When they looked at the oxygen this seated soleus was consuming per kilogram of the muscle, it was higher than the oxygen consumption of the entire lower limb during moderate treadmill walking, and higher too than during high-intensity treadmill work. Think about what is packed into the lower limb. The big quadriceps on the front of the thigh, the hamstrings behind, the great gluteal muscles at the hip, the calf, all of it. All those pounds of powerful tissue, driving hard on a treadmill. And gram for gram, this one small seated muscle bobbing gently was outbreathing all of it. The little furnace in the calf was burning hotter per unit of its own weight than the whole striding leg. I keep returning to the word disproportionate because there is no honest way around it. Everything we usually assume about muscles says the big ones do the big work. The quadriceps is enormous, it is what climbs the stairs, it is what stands you up out of the chair, and it is glorious at it, and it will also quit on you in minutes if you push it hard. Because as we said, it eats its own stored larder, and the larder runs dry. The soleus is small, and it was never built for a burst of glory. It was built for the long watch. And on the long watch, spending fuel from the passing bloodstream, it can keep that furnace roaring at a rate the great glamorous muscles could not sustain for more than a few furious minutes. Now, I owe you a piece of honesty here, the kind I would want if I were the one lying in the dark trusting a voice. That 5 times walking figure and the twice running figure, those precise comparisons come from Dr. Hamilton speaking directly and plainly about what his measurements imply. They are his words describing the size of the effect. The heart of the study, the doubled oxygen uptake, the carbohydrate burning going up a bit more than 2-fold and reaching close to 3-fold, the per kilogram output beating the whole limb, all of that sits in the peer-reviewed paper itself, checked and published. I tell you which is which because a number you cannot trace is just a rumor wearing a lab coat, and I would rather hand you a smaller honest thing than a larger shiny one. But even the cautious published core of it is enough to overturn everything we walked in believing. And notice, this is where the whole argument we have been building finally turns all the way over. We began the evening with a comfortable gospel. Move the big muscles. Go for a walk. Effort equals benefit, and the more it feels like work, the more good it must be doing. And every piece of that felt like plain common sense. Now look where we have arrived. The walk, that blessed prescription, is metabolically cheap almost by design, because the clever tendon spring in your ankle is quietly doing 1/3 of the work for free, sparing the muscle rather than spending it. And the thing that overturns it is not some grander, harder, sweatier exercise. It is smaller. It is quieter. It is a muscle so unassuming that most people go their whole lives without knowing its name, doing a motion so gentle you could do it under a desk and no one across the room would notice. That is the shape of the surprise, and I want you to let it settle rather than rush past it, because the number by itself, 5 times, is only a headline. The understanding underneath it is the real position, and we earned it slowly. We know now why the little muscle can spend at that furious rate without tiring, because it draws fuel from the river of the blood and barely touches its own stored reserve. We know why the seated posture is not a lazy compromise, but the very thing that unlocks the rate, because the lighter load lets the fibers shorten faster and through a fuller sweep. We know why the easy-to-wake neurons can hold the pattern for hours, because they were always the ones on the long postural watch. So when the meter reads 5 times a walk, you do not have to take it on faith. You can feel it click into place as the sum of everything we lay down. There is one more region of numbers I have been holding back, and it is, in some ways, the one that matters most to a body that has to live in the world. Because burning fuel fast in a calf is a fine curiosity, but the question a thoughtful person asks is, so what does it do to me? Does it change anything downstream? In the blood, in the sugar, in the fat that floats through the vessels after a meal? And it turns out it does. And the size of that change is its own small astonishment, waiting for us on the far side of a graph shaped like a hill. Hold the picture of the little furnace a moment longer, the heels rising and falling, the fuel drawn straight from the passing stream, and let us walk together, slowly, toward what happens to the sweetness in your blood after you have eaten. Picture that graph now, the one shaped like a hill. Along the bottom we mark the passing of time, minute by minute after a meal. Up the side we mark how much sugar is dissolved in the blood. You swallow a dose of glucose, a real jolt of it, the amount they use in the clinic, 75 grams dissolved in water, sweet as syrup, and you drink it down. What happens in an ordinary sedentary body is that the sugar floods in from the gut faster than the tissues can pull it out of the stream. So the line climbs. It climbs into a hill, a peak somewhere around the first hour, and then, slowly, as the insulin does its shepherding work, the line comes back down the far slope. That hill, that whole mound of extra sugar riding in the blood above where it started, is what a physiologist calls the excursion. It is the excursion of the sugar away from calm. And the taller and fatter that hill, the harder your vessels and your nerves and your kidneys have to sit inside a bath of sweetness they would rather not sit in. Now put the same person in a chair and have them do the quiet business we have been describing all this while, the heels lifting and falling, the little furnace in the calf drawing fuel straight from the passing stream. And watch what the hill does. It does not vanish, mind you. The sugar still comes in from the gut. But the hill flattens. It flattens by a startling amount. In the study out of Houston, the excursion of sugar shrank by 52%. More than half the hill simply gone, leveled, as though someone had come along in the night and shaved the top off a dune. If you wanted in the plain numbers a clinician would read off a meter, it came to roughly 50 milligrams of glucose per deciliter of blood less, in that window between the first and second hour, the very window when the tide is highest and does the most harm. 50 milligrams per deciliter is not a rounding error. That is the difference, in many a person, between a number their doctor frowns at and a number their doctor nods at. And here is a thing worth pausing over, because it is easy to skate past. The body did not accomplish this the expensive way. Ordinarily, when sugar floods the blood, the pancreas answers by pouring out insulin, and insulin is the hormone that knocks on the door of every cell and says, take up this sugar, store it, get it out of the stream. If you flatten the sugar hill by flogging the pancreas into making a great tidal wave of insulin, you have solved one problem by leaning hard on another. High insulin, held high for hours, is its own kind of wear. So the honest question is, did the little furnace flatten the sugar by demanding a flood of insulin, or did it flatten the sugar while the pancreas stayed calm? And the answer, the pleasing answer, is the second one. The insulin response, the hyperinsulinemia, the overflow of that hormone across the 3 hours after the drink, came down by 60%. So you get less sugar in the blood and less insulin in the blood, both at once. The tissue is pulling the sugar out of the stream directly, quietly, with those slow red fibers eating it as fuel the moment it drifts by, so the pancreas never has to shout. Think about what that means mechanically. The soleus, doing its patient work, is behaving like a drain set into the floor of a flooding room. The water comes in, and instead of rising to the ceiling and forcing you to bail frantically with buckets, which is the pancreas and its insulin, a great deal of it simply runs down the drain as fast as it arrives. The drain is those hungry mitochondria in the slow fibers, burning the glucose the instant it passes, turning it into carbon dioxide and water and warmth. Across one of those long sessions, 3 hours sitting after the sugary drink, the little furnace quietly consumed something on the order of 71 grams of carbohydrate. Look at that number against the drink itself. You swallowed 75 grams. The calf over the session oxidized about 71. It is almost as if the muscle ate nearly the whole meal, one passing molecule at a time before it could pile up into that harmful hill. Now I want to be careful and fair here, the way we have tried to be careful all along, because a single study with a clever result is a beginning and not a monument. Science does not run on one graph, however pretty. And so the sensible thing to ask is, did anyone else, later, in another place, with other people, see the same shape appear? And the answer, as of the work done a few years on from the first, is yes, in the direction that matters. A later clinical trial went looking in people already sliding toward trouble, the ones whose fasting sugar sits a little too high, the pre-diabetic, and had them do the same seated business. And the sugar hill in those people came down by something like 32% against their sedentary baseline. Now that is not the 52% of the first study, and I do not want to pretend it is. Different people, different protocol, a different measuring day. But it points the same way. It leans the same direction. When two experiments done by different hands lean the same way, you begin to trust that you are looking at a real feature of the world and not an accident of one afternoon in one laboratory. That is how the confidence gets built. Slowly, one honest replication at a time, and I would rather tell you the smaller honest number than dazzle you with the larger one and hide the rest. There is a subtlety folded into all this that I find quietly beautiful, and it is about who benefits. You might suppose that a trick like this would work best on the young athlete, the person whose muscles are already primed and hungry, and would do little for the tired, the old, the person who has not exercised in years. That would be the reasonable guess. But it is not what they found. The flattening of the sugar hill showed up regardless of whether the person was a man or a woman, regardless of age, regardless of how many hours a day they habitually sat, regardless of how many steps they took. Let me say that again gently, because it overturns something you did not know you assumed. It did not matter if you were a person who already walked a great deal. The person who logged 10,000 steps and the person who logged 500 both got the benefit from the seated furnace. Because the seated furnace is not doing the same job as the steps. It is reaching a metabolic channel the steps never opened. And in fact, the very lowest intensity version of the movement, the gentle one with the small range of motion, the one that barely raises the whole body's burn by half above rest, was enough in the people with the impaired fasting sugar to cut their sugar hill by something like 40%. The people who needed it most got a great deal from the least amount of effort. That is not how most interventions in medicine behave. Usually the sickest need to work the hardest for the smallest scrap of improvement. Here it ran the other way. And why should that be? Come back to the fuel. Because the fuel explains the endurance, and the endurance explains everything downstream. A muscle that ran on its own stored glycogen, its own private larder packed into the fibers, would blaze for a few minutes and then flame out. And a few minutes cannot flatten a hill that takes 2 hours to rise and fall. But we established that the soleus during this work barely touches its own larder. The glycogen it burns is almost nothing, a mere 2% of the fuel. It reaches instead into the passing blood and pulls out the glucose and the fat drifting by, the sugar and the triglycerides, the very cargo that a meal dumps into your circulation, and it burns that cargo directly. So the muscle's fuel supply is the same thing as the disease's raw material. The soleus eats precisely the surplus that would otherwise harm you. That is the whole trick in one sentence. It is not burning some inert reserve off in a corner. It is standing at the mouth of the river, eating the flood. That is also why it does not tire. A muscle burning its own glycogen empties a tank and stops. A muscle drinking from the bloodstream has in effect no tank to empty, because the stream is refilled by every meal and by the fat you carry. And so the people in these studies sat and did this work not for 2 minutes, not for 10, but for 3 hours, 4 hours, and reported no fatigue, no soreness, no aching the next morning. And the researchers found no strain, no injury in the elderly among them and in the ones who had never exercised in their lives. Now hold that fact right up against the sugar result, because the two are the same fact wearing two costumes. The reason it flattens the hill so well is exactly the reason it does not exhaust you. Both come from the strange, thin fuel line running straight from the blood into the slow red fibers, bypassing the larder entirely. The endurance and the medicine are one property seen from two sides. So we have walked, slowly, all the way from the shape of a hill to the reason the hill lies down, and we have found at the bottom of it the same quiet fibers we met an hour ago, doing the same patient thing, only now we see what it costs the disease. But I have been speaking as though sugar were the whole story, and it is not. There is fat in that passing stream too, the greasy cargo that a meal leaves floating in the blood long after the sugar has settled, and the furnace has something to say about that as well, something that a body carrying too much of that grease would very much want to hear. Let us turn now, unhurried, to the fat. Picture the blood after a good meal. Most people think of sugar rising in it, and we have spent a long while on that sugar. But there is a second cargo, and it is heavier and slower and stickier. It is fat. When you eat, and especially when you eat something rich, the gut packages fat into little droplets wrapped in protein and sends them out into the circulation, and the liver adds its own parcels, and for hours afterward the blood is faintly milky with this grease, floating along in bundles the doctors call very low-density lipoprotein. These little triglyceride-carrying rafts drifting past every organ, looking for somewhere to unload. And here is a thing worth sitting with quietly. Those rafts do not get used up quickly the way sugar does. They linger. They hang about in the stream long after the sugar has been tidied away, and a body that is forever awash in that lingering grease is a body heading, slowly and without any drama, toward trouble. Now what does the little furnace in the calf do with all this? Remember what kind of muscle it is. It is not a sprinter's muscle, hungry for quick sugar it can rip apart in a hurry. It is a slow, patient red muscle, packed with those tiny power stations, the mitochondria, and mitochondria are the only place in the whole cell where fat can actually be burned. You cannot burn fat in a hurry. You cannot burn it in the fast pale fibers that fire and fatigue. Fat is a slow fuel, a smoldering log rather than a fistful of dry straw, and it can only be consumed in the presence of oxygen, patiently, molecule by molecule, in exactly the kind of fiber that fills the soleus almost wall to wall. So when this muscle is kept gently working, hour after hour, it does something the rest of the resting body will not bother to do. It reaches into that milky stream and pulls the fat out and feeds it into the fire. The measurement they made is a lovely plain one. In a person who has not eaten, who is simply fasting, the body is already burning some fat ticking over, using a little of its stored grease to keep the lights on. That is the ordinary background rate. And when they had such a fasting person sit and do this small heel movement, the slow lifting of the ball of the foot under a quarter of the body's weight, the rate of fat burning did not creep up a few percent. It doubled. The furnace, kindled in a muscle that is 1 part in 100 of your body, took the whole body's fat burning and turned it up to twice what it had been, while the person sat perfectly still from the waist up, doing nothing that would raise a sweat or quicken the breath in any way you would notice across a room. And the greasy rafts in the blood, those triglyceride parcels, came down. Their level in the circulation dropped. That is the fire reaching out and thinning the stream, taking the cargo that was drifting and finding no home, and giving it a home, a hot one, at the bottom of the leg. You can feel, I hope, why this matters beyond any single afternoon. A stream that is repeatedly cleared is a stream that spends less of its life thick and loaded. And a great deal of what goes wrong in the slow diseases of a sitting life is exactly the trouble of a stream that stays loaded too long, too often, day after year. Let me put a single number beside all this, because it anchors the thing in a way words alone will not. In one of their longer sessions, after a person had swallowed that same 75-gram dose of sugar we spoke of, they let the heel movement run for 180 minutes. 3 hours of this quiet lifting. And across those 3 hours, the little muscle burned through something on the order of 71 grams of carbohydrate. Think of what that means. You gave the body 75 grams of sugar, and the calf, working alone, quietly disposed of very nearly the whole of it, oxidized it, sent it up the chimney as warmth and breath, so that it never got the chance to pile up in the blood and provoke the long insulin alarm. The furnace did not just blunt the peak of the sugar curve. Over the length of the afternoon, it consumed almost the entire meal's worth of that one fuel, and doubled the fat burning besides, all from a movement so small a person beside you would not know you were doing it. I want to slow down here, because it is easy to hear a run of numbers and let them wash past like traffic. Sit with the strangeness of the proportion once more. 1% of you, a muscle you could hold in 2 hands. And it is reaching into the blood and pulling out both the sugar and the fat, the two great cargoes that a modern sitting body cannot seem to clear, and it is doing so not for a few furious minutes, but for hours, without tiring, without soreness, without asking for the sugar in its own larder. Every other muscle would have long since burned through its stored starch and quit sore and trembling. This one just keeps drawing thin fuel off the top of the stream and burning it clean. That, and not any single headline figure, is the quiet miracle of the thing. Now I have led you to believe that the whole benefit lives in the furnace, in the burning, in the metabolism, and that is where most of it lives. But there is a second gift this muscle gives, and it has nothing to do with fuel at all. It has to do with plumbing. Consider the trouble of standing upright, or of sitting upright, which is nearly as bad. Your blood has to come back up. The heart, that marvelous pump in the chest, is very good at throwing blood outward and downward, pushing it out to the toes with real force. But getting it back up the legs against the whole pull of gravity, from the far bottom of you all the way to the chest, that is a different problem, and the heart does not solve it alone. It cannot. The pressure has faded to almost nothing by the time the blood has trickled through the fine vessels of the foot. Something down there has to help lift it home. And what helps is muscle. When the muscles of the calf squeeze, they press on the veins threaded through and around them, and those veins have little one-way flaps inside, small valves that let blood pass upward, but slam shut against any slipping back down. So every squeeze of the calf milks a slug of blood up toward the heart, one flap at a time, and the valves hold the gain between squeezes. This is why the old anatomists gave the calf muscle a second name. They called it the peripheral heart. A second heart down in the leg, not beating on its own, but pressed into surface every time the muscle contracts, bailing the blood upward against gravity like a person bailing a boat. Now think of what happens to that second heart during a long day in a chair. It falls silent. The calf does not squeeze, because you are not walking, and so the blood in the legs grows still and pools, sitting heavy in the low veins hour after hour, and the return to the true heart slows. There is a whole quiet unpleasantness that follows from that stillness, the swelling, the sluggishness, the small risks of blood that sits too long unstirred. The peripheral heart, in a sitting life, is a pump left switched off. And here is the loveliness of it. The small heel movement we have been circling all this while does not only feed the furnace. It also, with the very same contraction, works the pump. Every gentle lift of that heel squeezes the calf, and every squeeze milks another slug of blood up the veins, and so the second heart, which had gone quiet in the chair, begins beating again, softly, continuously, for as long as you keep the movement going. You get the metabolism and the plumbing from one and the same motion. The furnace and the pump are housed in the same muscle, and you cannot light one without starting the other. So while the blood is being cleared of its sugar and its fat by the burning, it is also being lifted home more briskly by the squeezing. Two entirely separate goods flowing out of one small, unremarkable act, done sitting down, costing you almost nothing but the willingness to keep the ball of your foot slowly rising and falling. I find that a beautiful economy. Nature did not design this muscle to be a furnace and a pump at once. It designed it most likely for the plain business of holding a two-legged animal upright across a long day, and the furnace and the pump are what fall out of that job when you finally decide to use the muscle on purpose, for its own sake, in a way ordinary standing and ordinary walking never quite ask of it. We stumbled onto both by asking one honest question about why a walk does so little, and the answer keeps handing us more than we went looking for. But there is still a question I have been carefully stepping around, and it is the largest one of all. If this small quiet muscle can do all of this, then how does it stand against the things we already trust? Against exercise itself? Against the pills? Against all the hard advice we have been given for a lifetime? Let us weigh it honestly against them, and see what the scale says. Set two things side by side on the table. On the left, put everything we already believe in, the whole cabinet of trusted remedies. A brisk walk in the morning, a jog when you have the knees for it, a gym membership, a careful diet, the fast that skips a meal or skips a day, and then the pills, the ones a doctor writes on a small pad and hands across a desk. On the right, put one small quiet muscle in the back of the calf, doing a slow seated heel raise while its owner sits perfectly still. It looks like no contest at all. The left side is heavy with authority. The right side is almost embarrassing in its modesty. And yet, if we are honest about the numbers we have collected so far, the modest side keeps refusing to lose. Let me take the first challenger, exercise itself, because that is the one we respect the most. When Hamilton's people put the seated heel raise up against the treadmill, they did not measure the whole body in some vague way. They measured the oxygen consumed by a kilogram of muscle, and then they compared that to the oxygen consumed by the entire lower limb of a person walking at a moderate pace and then at a hard pace. And here is the thing that ought to make you put your cup of tea down slowly. The little soleus, working per kilogram, drew down more oxygen than the whole lower limb did on that treadmill. Not the same. More. A muscle that is roughly 1 part in 100 of your body weight, breathing harder for its size than the great columns of your thighs and hips all working together at a real running clip. I have turned that fact over many times, and it does not lose its strangeness. It is as if a single candle in a large hall gave off more heat than the fireplace. Now I want to be fair, because being unfair to a strong idea is how you fool yourself. Running does more than burn oxygen in the calf. It moves the whole animal. It trains the heart to pump against a bigger demand. It shakes the bones and tells them to stay dense. It floods the blood with the messengers that lift your mood. The seated heel raise does not pretend to do all that. If you want a strong heart and strong legs and the particular joy of moving fast under an open sky, then go and run, and no small muscle in a chair will ever replace that. But that is not the contest we are running here. The contest is narrower and for most people far more urgent. The contest is this: how do you keep the sugar and the fat in your blood from sitting there hour after hour doing you harm during the long stretches of a day when you are not exercising and never will be? Because that is the true shape of the problem. Nobody runs for 10 hours. Nobody jogs while answering letters at a desk. The exercise we prize so highly is a visitor. It comes for 30 minutes, perhaps an hour, and then it leaves, and the body goes back to sitting. And the sitting is where the damage quietly accrues. So the honest comparison is not the heel raise against the run. It is the heel raise against the empty chair, the chair you were going to sit in anyway, for hours, doing nothing for your metabolism at all. Against that opponent, which is the real one, the true opponent of a whole population, the little muscle does not merely win. It wins in a walkover, because the other side never even shows up. Take the next challenger, weight loss. For a lifetime we have been told the arithmetic of the body is a ledger of pounds. Weigh less and the blood sugar behaves. Lose the fat around the middle and the insulin works again. There is real truth in that. I will not wave it away. But look at what the seated muscle did without asking anyone to lose a single ounce first. The people in that room did not diet down for weeks to earn the benefit. They sat, they raised their heels, and while they were doing it, the sugar coming off a meal rose only half as steeply as it otherwise would have. The improvement did not wait for the scale to move. It arrived during the very session in a body that was, for that afternoon, exactly the weight it had been that morning. That tells you the benefit is not really about mass at all. It is about a working muscle pulling fuel out of the passing blood in real time, the way a water wheel takes the current that happens to be flowing past it without first draining the river. And here is a subtler point that I find lovely. To lose weight, you must in some fashion spend more than you take in, and that is hard precisely because the body fights it. It is stingy. It hoards. It slows itself down when you eat less, so that the ledger never balances the way you hoped. The seated muscle sidesteps that whole miserable argument. It does not ask you to eat less. It quietly raises the amount of fuel your body burns while you sit, doubling the fat you oxidize in the fasting state, And it does this without triggering the alarms that starve a diet of its promised reward. It is a way of spending more without the body noticing it has been robbed. Then there is fasting, the fashionable cousin of weight loss, the skipping of meals to give the metabolism a rest and let the fat come out of storage. I have nothing unkind to say about a fast. There is real physiology in it. But listen to how Hamilton frames his own result, because he is not a shy man about it and the words are careful. He says that for raising and sustaining the whole body's oxidative metabolism, for keeping that furnace turned up over hours and hours, this method outdoes exercise, it outdoes weight loss, and it outdoes intermittent fasting. Not one of them. All three, on that particular measure, the sustained burning of fuel over a long stretch. Now a claim like that, from the man who ran the study, you hold at arm's length and inspect. But the mechanism underneath it is exactly what would let it be true. Fasting waits for the body to reach into its stores. The heel raise does not wait for anything. It burns while you sit, whether you have eaten or not, and it keeps burning long past the point where a fast is merely making you hungry. Which brings us to the heaviest challenger of all, the one that comes in a bottle. The pills. And here I want to be especially careful, because medicine that lowers blood sugar has saved a great many lives, and I would never tell a soul to pour their prescription down the sink on the strength of a lecture. But set the mechanisms beside each other and something remarkable stands out. Most of the drugs work by pushing on a lever. They squeeze more insulin out of the pancreas, or they make the tissues listen to insulin more keenly, or they tell the liver to stop pouring sugar into the blood, or they simply flush sugar out through the kidney. Every one of these is a chemical instruction, a message shouted at an organ, and everyone carries the price of shouting. The seated muscle does something different in kind. It does not send a message. It opens a door and eats. It pulls the glucose out of the blood the way a working muscle always has, through the plain honest act of contracting and needing fuel, the oldest arrangement in the body, older than any pharmacy. And Hamilton says the quiet part without flinching. He says he is unaware of any drug, existing or on the horizon, that comes close to raising and sustaining the whole body's oxidative metabolism at this magnitude. Read that slowly. A physiologist who has spent his career measuring these things says the little muscle, used on purpose, outperforms the medicine cabinet on the specific matter of keeping the metabolic fire burning across the hours. That is not a small saying. It is the kind of saying that, if it holds up under other hands in other labs, changes what we tell people to do with the long gray middle of their day. I said if it holds up, and I meant it, because that caution is not decoration. It is the whole spirit of the thing. One laboratory found this. The people were relatively few. The sessions, though long, were counted in afternoons, not in years. The great question that no single study can answer is whether a heel raise practiced faithfully across decades keeps a body out of the ditch that diabetes digs so slowly. We do not know that yet. What we do have is a first echo from another team, a pilot in pre-diabetic people, that saw the after-meal sugar rise cut by roughly a third rather than a half, under a different protocol in different hands. The number is smaller, but it points the same way, and in this business pointing the same way is worth a great deal. When a strange result refuses to shrink to nothing the moment someone else looks at it, you begin, cautiously, to believe there is a real animal behind the tracks in the snow. So where does the scale finally settle? Not on the silly conclusion that you should stop walking, stop running, stop caring what you eat, and simply wiggle your heels through life. That would be a foolish reading, and I will not have it. The honest reading is quieter and stranger than that. It is that we have spent a century measuring the wrong muscle at the wrong moment, prizing the vivid half hour of exercise and ignoring the vast still hours around it, when a small overlooked muscle in the back of the leg, one part in 100 of us, was sitting there the whole time, idle, waiting, perfectly capable of turning the sitting itself into work. We did not lack the muscle. We lacked the question. And once you have asked the question honestly, you cannot quite unask it, and the chair you are sitting in will never look entirely innocent again. Let me stay with that chair a little longer, because there is something happening in it that I have not yet told you, and it belongs to the plumbing of the body rather than its furnace. You know that your heart is a pump. It sits in your chest and it squeezes, and it pushes blood outward through the arteries with real force. But here is a problem the heart cannot solve alone. Once the blood has gone all the way down to your feet, it has to come back up. And coming back up means climbing against gravity, through soft veins that have almost no muscle of their own in their walls. The heart's push has mostly spent itself by the time the blood reaches your ankles. So what lifts it home? For a long while, people did not have a tidy answer, and then they noticed something rather lovely. The muscles of the calf, and the soleus most of all, wrap around the deep veins of the leg. Every time that muscle tightens, it squeezes those veins the way your hand squeezes a tube of toothpaste. There are little one-way flaps inside the veins, valves that let blood pass upward but slam shut against any backward slide. So each squeeze of the soleus nudges a slug of blood up the leg, and the valve behind it closes and it cannot fall back. Squeeze, and it rises. Squeeze again, and it rises further. The muscle is acting as a second heart, a quiet auxiliary pump tucked into the back of your lower leg. Some people have taken to calling it the peripheral heart, and I rather like the name because it tells you at once what it does and how little credit it usually gets. Now think about what this means for the person sitting still for 10 hours. That second heart is switched off. The blood pools lazily in the legs, the return sluggish, the whole circulation of the lower body drowsing. And then the same person stands up and their pressure lurches and they feel a swimming in the head and nobody quite connects it to the still muscle that should have been pumping all along. When you perform the heel raise in the chair, you are not only lighting the metabolic furnace we have talked about for hours now. You are also, with every gentle contraction, turning that second heart back on. The blood begins to climb again. The pump resumes its slow patient shift. It is a bonus, a thing riding along for free on top of the sugar and fat you are burning, and it is the kind of 2-for-1 that nature hands out now and then to reward you for asking the right question. I want to put a number beside the sugar business, because numbers, when they are honest, have a way of ending arguments. Imagine you drink a solution with 75 grams of glucose dissolved in it. That is the standard challenge, the thing they give you in a clinic to see how your body handles a flood of sugar. In an ordinary sitting person, the blood glucose climbs into a sharp peak in the hour or two after, and the body panics a little and floods the bloodstream with insulin to shove that sugar out of sight. Now run the same test, same drink, same person, but this time they are doing the heel raise the whole while. The peak flattens. The rise in blood sugar between the first and second hour comes down by more than half, something on the order of 50 milligrams per deciliter less at the top of the curve. Better than half again. And the insulin, that emergency hormone the body pours out when it is overwhelmed, drops by around 60% across the 3 hours that follow. The body simply does not need to panic, because the little muscle in the leg is quietly eating the sugar as fast as it arrives straight out of the blood before it can pile up. Sit with the strangeness of that. Half again. From wiggling your heels, not from a drug, not from a diet, not from an hour on a treadmill leaving you red and gasping. From a motion so small that a person across the room would not know you were doing it. And when they went and tried this on people whose sugar handling was already going wrong, the ones with what they call impaired fasting glucose, the folks whose bodies had begun to fumble the very job we are talking about, even the gentlest version of the motion, the small 15-degree lift, brought their sugar excursion down by something near 40%. The people who needed it most were helped, not less, but plainly. I told you I would be careful with claims, and I will keep my word. That 52% figure comes from a single laboratory doing careful work, and one careful laboratory is a beginning, not a monument. So I was glad, genuinely glad, when another group came along a few years later and ran their own version on pre-diabetic people, a different protocol, their own hands, their own subjects. They did not get exactly the same number. They got a reduction closer to a third, around 32%. Now some people hear two different numbers and feel cheated, as though the disagreement means somebody lied. That is not how it works. The two numbers point the same direction. They both say the sugar came down, and came down a lot, under conditions that were not identical. When two separate labs, using separate methods, both find the arrow pointing the same way, your confidence should go up, not down. The exact size of an effect will always wobble from study to study. What matters is whether the effect is real and which way it leans, and here it leans hard and it leans the same way twice. Let me draw together the whole strange fuel story because it is the hinge on which all of this turns, and I do not want it to slip past you as you drift. Most muscles, when you ask them to work hard, reach first for their own private larder. Tucked inside the muscle fiber is a store of glycogen, a coiled reserve of sugar, and the big fast muscles of your thigh burn through it greedily. That is why a sprinter is spent in seconds and a person doing heavy squats is trembling within minutes. They are eating their own pantry, and the pantry is small, and when it is bare they are done. But the soleus, doing this particular motion, barely touches its own pantry at all. Something like 2% of its fuel during the heel raise comes from its stored glycogen. 2%. It leaves its own larder almost untouched, and instead it reaches out into the passing bloodstream and takes what floats by. The glucose from your last meal, the fat carried in those little cargo packages the body ships around, and it burns those directly. And that, more than anything else, is why it does not tire. A muscle that lives on its own reserves must stop when the reserves run dry. A muscle that lives on the river flowing past it can go as long as the river flows. This is not a metaphor I am stretching for effect. It is the plain mechanical reason a group of ordinary people, some of them elderly, some of them exercise naive, none of them athletes, could sit and perform this motion for 3 hours, 4 hours, better than 4 hours in a testing day, and report no fatigue, no soreness, no ache the next morning, no injury across the whole study. You cannot do that with a thigh muscle. You cannot do it with your biceps. You could not do it with almost any voluntary motion your body knows. But this one small, slow twitch muscle, fed from the passing current instead of its own cupboard, and worked at a load of only a quarter of your body weight because you are sitting, will simply keep going, hour upon hour, like a mill wheel turning in a stream that never stops. There was one person in this work who logged more than 60,000 contractions in a single day across both legs. Let that settle. 60,000 small lifts of the heel, and no wreckage the next morning, no torn thing, no swelling, no limp. Try that with any other exercise you can name, and you would be crippled. The reason you are not is everything we have spent these hours unwinding. The fiber type that resists fatigue. The fuel drawn from the blood and not the pantry. The feather-light load of the seated posture. The low-threshold motor neurons that fire without complaint, the same ones that have held you upright your whole standing life. It all conspires toward one quiet, almost absurd conclusion that this particular muscle, doing this particular thing, is very nearly tireless. And so we arrive, gently, at the leg switch itself, the thing the whole title promised you and I have made you wait for. Because one leg is good, and 2 legs, as you would guess, are about twice as good, roughly double the metabolic benefit, for the obvious reason that you have twice the muscle working. You can lift both heels together, or you can rock them, one and then the other, left and then right. A slow, soft alternation like the idle tapping of someone lost in thought. That rocking, that switch, is not a gimmick. It is simply a way of keeping both of your peripheral hearts, both of your little furnaces, turning over at once without either one ever needing to strain. And the man who found all this out will tell you not to storm at it, not to attack it like a gym drill, but to begin with 2 minutes. 2 minutes. That is where he says to start. 2 minutes and no medals for suffering. That is a strange instruction to hear, because we have been taught, all of us, that the good things cost pain, that the ledger of the body only pays out what you bleed into it. And here is a man who spent years watching this little muscle in the calf, telling you to sit softly in a chair and rock your heels for the length of time it takes to boil an egg. So let me ask the thing you are surely asking. If you do that, and only that, and you keep at it, what actually happens inside you? Not in the muscle. We have talked about the muscle enough to know it can idle there for hours, humming, sipping. I mean out in the rest of the body, in the blood, in the slow tidal chemistry of a person who has just eaten a meal. Picture that meal. You drink down a sugary drink, the kind they use in the laboratory to test people, 75 grams of glucose dissolved in water, a deliberate flood. In an ordinary sitting person, the blood sugar climbs like a wave rising against a harbor wall, up and up in the first hour, and the body panics a little and pours out insulin to beat it back down. That climb, that excursion, is the thing the doctors watch, because a wave that climbs too high too often is the slow beginning of a great deal of trouble. Now sit the same person down with the same drink, but this time have them rock their heels, that soft alternation, the leg switch, going gently the whole while. And the wave does not climb the way it did. It comes up perhaps half as far. The rise between the first hour and the second falls by about half, something on the order of 50 milligrams per deciliter less sugar hanging in the blood at the peak. 52%, they measured, a 52% smaller excursion. And the insulin, the frantic hormone, drops to 60% less of the overshoot across the 3 hours that follow. Sit with how odd that is. The muscle is not out there in the arms and the chest and the great engines of the thighs. It is 1% of you tucked in the back of the shin, and yet by working it softly, you have taken a meal that would have crashed over the harbor wall and turned it into a gentle swell that laps up and slides back. The sugar you drank is being pulled out of the blood and burned quietly by that little furnace before it can pile up and do its mischief. And here is the part that ought to make you smile in the dark. The people who need this most are exactly the people it helped most. In the ones whose fasting sugar was already creeping up, already sitting in that uneasy country between healthy and diabetic, even the gentlest version of the movement, the small one, the one with only about 15 degrees of travel in the ankle, the one that barely looks like anything at all, still cut their sugar excursion by roughly 40%. The smallest dose in the people furthest along still worked. It did not care how old they were. It did not care whether they were men or women. It did not care how many hours they habitually sat or how few steps they took in a day. That is a rare and beautiful kind of result, because most things we prescribe work best in the people who need them least, the young and the fit and the already well. This did the opposite. It reached down toward the ones the usual advice had quietly given up on. Now think about what that means against the size of the problem. More than half of the grown people in this country are already carrying metabolic syndrome or the diabetes itself. Among those past 65, 4 in 5 are living with diabetes or the shadow of it, the prediabetes, the warning that has not yet become the disease. And these same people are sitting on average something like 10 hours of every waking day. We have built a world of chairs. We sit to work, we sit to travel, we sit to rest from the sitting. And the standard cure, the one every doctor has offered for as long as there have been doctors, is to stand up and walk. Which is fine advice, honest advice, and yet we have already seen the trouble buried inside it. Walking, for all its virtues, is built by evolution to be cheap. The catapult in your ankle sees to that. You can walk a mile and your soleus will barely have broken into a sweat, because the spring did most of the work and handed the muscle a free ride. So the very efficiency we admire in our own gait is, from the furnace's point of view, a kind of laziness written into the design. And the little heel rock, the thing that looks like fidgeting, deliberately throws that efficiency away. It refuses the free ride. It makes the muscle shorten and shorten again, spending the fuel the walking so cleverly saved. That is the whole inversion. Walking is a machine for not spending energy. This is a machine for spending it. Gently, endlessly, on purpose. Let me follow the fuel a little further, because the sugar is only half the story. In a person who has not eaten, who is fasting, the body is supposed to be burning fat, drawing on its long-term stores. Set that person rocking their heels, and the rate of fat burning roughly doubles. Doubles. And the particular fat it goes after is the kind that rides around in the blood as little parcels called triglycerides, the ones packaged up and shipped out from the liver. Those parcels thin out. The blood grows cleaner of them. Over a single long session, close to 3 hours after that sugary drink, the working legs quietly oxidized something like 70 grams of carbohydrate, burned it clean away, most of a candy bar's worth of sugar turned into warmth and breath by a muscle you have spent your whole life ignoring. And the man who measured all this, who watched it happen over and over in his laboratory in Houston, chose his words carefully when he described what he had found, the way a careful person does when he knows the words will be doubted. He said that for raising and holding up the whole body's slow oxidative fire, this thing seems to do better than exercise, better than losing weight, better than the fasting people practice. And then he said something that a cautious scientist does not say lightly. He said he knew of no drug, none existing and none on the horizon, that comes anywhere close to lifting and sustaining the body's oxidative metabolism to this degree and for this long. That is an enormous claim. You are right to hold it at arm's length and squint at it. But it was not shouted from a rooftop. It was set down in the measured language of a laboratory report, next to the numbers that provoked it. I will not tell you it is magic, because it is not, and the moment anyone tells you a thing is magic, you should keep your hand on your wallet. What I will tell you is that other hands have begun to reach for the same thread. A few years on from that first work, another small clinical study went looking to see whether the effect would show up again in people with the early sugar trouble, the prediabetes. It did. Under a different setup with different details, they saw the after-meal sugar wave come down by about a third, 32%, where the first study had seen half. Not the same number. You would not expect the same number, in a different room with different people and a different protocol, but pointing the same way. And in this rough and stubborn business, 2 studies pointing the same way is worth a great deal more than 1 study shouting alone. There is one more gift in all this that has nothing to do with sugar or fat at all, and I would be cheating you not to mention it. Remember that this muscle has an old nickname. They call it the second heart, the peripheral heart, and there is real physics in the name. Your blood has an easy time flowing downhill out toward the feet, because gravity is glad to help. Getting it back up, out of the feet and the shins, and home to the chest is the hard direction, the uphill fight. Your heart pushes from above, but down in the legs it has help, and much of that help is the calf muscle itself. Every time the soleus squeezes, it presses on the veins threaded through it, and those veins have little one-way doors, valves, so the squeeze can only push the blood one way, upward, homeward. Squeeze and the door ahead opens and the door behind shuts. Relax and it fills again. Squeeze again and up it goes another stage. Like a bucket brigade passing water up a hill, hand to hand, no bucket ever sliding back. Now the whole while you sit rocking those heels, that brigade is working, steadily hour upon hour. The blood that would otherwise pool and grow sluggish down in your ankles is being handed up the line back toward the heart, gently, without pause. So the movement you are doing for the sake of your blood sugar is, at the very same time and for free, tending to your circulation, keeping the tide moving in the low country of your legs. One small action, 2 quiet benefits, the metabolic furnace and the second heart, running side by side in the same 1% of your body, both of them lit by the same soft rocking that costs you no strain and no sweat and asks of you to begin only 2 minutes.